There is a portrait in the east drawing room of a house that no longer belongs to anyone living. The woman in it is perhaps 70, perhaps older. It is difficult to say with certainty, because she has arranged herself in the painting the way she arranged everything in her life, precisely, without sentiment, without any detail offered that she did not intend for you to see. Her hands rest in her lap. Her spine does not touch the back of the chair. Around her neck is a rope of pearls so long and so heavy that a younger woman might have let it pull her forward, but she does not lean. She sits perfectly still, the way women sit when they have spent a lifetime deciding what stillness means. The house around her is quiet now. The fires have been banked. The grandchildren who once ran through these corridors are grown and gone, some of them to distant cities, some of them to early graves, some of them to the kind of slow financial ruin that looks, from a distance, like an ordinary life. The fortune is still here, though. She made sure of that. She always made sure of that. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is a particular kind of mourning that belongs only to very old houses. It arrives before the household stirs, before the radiators begin their slow ticking, before the light has decided what colour it intends to be. The rooms are cool and held in a hush that feels almost deliberate, as though the house itself is waiting for something. The curtains hang without moving. The clocks on the mantels keep their sound to themselves. The flowers in the entrance hall, cut yesterday by someone paid to cut them, stand in their arrangements with a patience that borders on acceptance. In these hours, before anyone else is awake, the old woman is already at her writing desk. She rises at 5:30. She has risen at 5:30 for 60 years. The maid who brings her tea knows not to knock, only to set the tray on the table outside the door and retreat before the sound of her own footsteps disturbs the morning's composition. The tea is a specific temperature. The cup is a specific one, bone china with a narrow band of cobalt blue around the rim, from a set that survived 2 house moves, 1 estate auction, and the brief chaotic period in the 1930s when it seemed for a moment that everything might have to go. It did not go. She did not allow it to go. The writing desk is a small rosewood piece that came from her mother's house, which came from her grandmother's house before that, which came originally from a town in the north of England that none of them had ever visited. The provenance mattered less than the object. The object was here, in this room, on this particular corner of the floor, exactly where it had always been, and that continuity, that unbroken line from then to now, was itself a form of wealth that no accountant had ever known how to record. She opens the leather-bound ledger that sits always on the right-hand side of the desk. The entries in it are made in a hand that has changed very little in 50 years. The numbers are small and precise. Each line describes an expenditure or an income, a dividend received, or a bill sent forward to the solicitor's office, a charitable donation calculated to the penny against the tax advantage it represented, a household cost reviewed against the quarterly budget she's maintained, in various forms, in various houses, since the year she turned 30 and decided that no one else could be trusted with this particular task. She was not always a ruthless woman. That is worth understanding from the beginning. She was, in her youth, described by everyone who knew her as warm, attentive, the kind of young woman who remembered the names of servants' children and inquired after them on subsequent visits, the kind of woman who sat at the bedsides of ailing relatives long after other visitors had made their excuses and left. She brought flowers, she wrote letters, she arrived on time. All of that remained true. It remained true throughout her long marriage and through the years of raising children and managing a household and attending to the 1,000 small obligations that filled a life of her particular kind. She was not ruthless in the way the word is sometimes used, meaning cold or indifferent or without scruple. She was ruthless in a more precise and much older sense of the word. She was without ruth, without the yielding quality, without the capacity to be moved from a decided position by someone else's discomfort. When her eldest son came to her in 1962, with a proposal to liquidate the Northern holdings in exchange for a sum that would have allowed him to finance a business venture he had been pursuing for 3 years, she listened to him for the full 40 minutes he had prepared to speak. She poured him tea herself. She asked 3 questions, each of them quiet and specific, and then she declined. The Northern holdings remained intact until her death and beyond it. because she had taken the necessary legal steps to ensure they would, steps she had taken quietly and without consultation, in the same year that her son first mentioned the idea in passing at a family dinner. She had recognised the direction of his thinking before he had fully recognised it himself. That was perhaps her most remarkable quality. She saw where things were going before they arrived. You may find yourself wondering how a woman learns to see that clearly, to read the future in a dinner table conversation, to understand what a ledger entry means not just today but 20 years from now. The answer, when you sit with it quietly enough, is simply time. She had been paying attention for a very long time. The wealth she protected was not in the original sense hers. It had come to her through marriage, as most wealth came to women of her generation, transferred from her father's family to her husband's, and finally, through the particular alchemy of widowhood, to her own administration. Her husband had been a good man and an adequate investor, better than average at maintaining what he had inherited, less gifted at growing it. He died at 68 of a heart complaint that had announced itself quietly for years before making its final and decisive statement. She was 59 at the time. She had 34 more years ahead of her. In those 34 years, she would outlive her husband's 2 brothers, both of whom died without male heirs in the direct line. She would outlive 3 of the 4 solicitors who had managed the family's legal affairs across 4 decades. She would outlive 2 of her own children, her second son at 42, her youngest daughter at 57, and the particular grief of those losses, which was genuine and deep and entirely private, would be processed at her writing desk in the early morning hours while the rest of the house slept, and would be put away when the day required her presence elsewhere. She had no talent for public grief. It seemed to her undignified in a way she could not quite articulate, and the inability to articulate it did not trouble her. Not everything required articulation. What the fortune looked like when it came to her was this: a set of properties scattered across 3 counties, a portfolio of investments that her husband's solicitor described as conservative and her husband's brother described as timid, a house in London that needed the roof replacing, and a trust arrangement of sufficient complexity that its full dimensions took her 18 months to understand completely. She spent those 18 months understanding it. She hired a second solicitor to explain what the first solicitor said. She hired an accountant who owed no loyalty to any previous arrangement. She read the documents herself, which none of the men who advised her expected her to do, and when she found the clause in the original trustee that gave her a power of appointment she had not previously been aware of, she said nothing about it to anyone for 6 weeks while she considered how and whether to use it. That was in 1974. The consequences of the decision she made in those 6 weeks are still being felt in the financial arrangements of 3 families today. There is something quietly remarkable about the long view, the ability to act today for a result that will not be visible for 20 years. Most people cannot hold that kind of time in their minds. The urgency of the present keeps pulling their attention back to what is happening now, to the argument at the dinner table, to the bill that needs paying, to the son who is looking at her with that expression that means he has a proposal she's not going to like. She could hold 20 years easily. She could hold 50. The morning light has moved slightly while she writes. The quality of it is different now from what it was 20 minutes ago. Warmer, more decided. Outside the window, the garden is beginning to separate itself from the general grey of the early morning into its particular shapes. The yew hedge that she planted in 1961, which is now 14 feet tall and entirely impenetrable, the rose beds that follow the original plan she drew in the first summer after her husband's death, the stone path that leads to the small enclosed garden where the oldest roses grow, the ones that came as cuttings from her mother's garden, which had them as cuttings from somewhere before that. She sets down her pen and picks up her tea. It is still exactly the right temperature. She has learned, over the course of a very long life, how to time these things. The fortune she was protecting was, by the standards of the time in which she lived it, substantial, not extraordinary, not the kind that appeared in newspapers or generated gossip in the way that the great industrial fortunes did. It was the other kind, the older kind, built not on a single dramatic act of accumulation but on the slow accretion of good decisions made across several generations, each one adding a little, none of them subtracting too much. The whole edifice rising quietly over time the way a good garden grows, not through spectacle but through patience and the correct management of roots. She understood roots. She understood that the visible part of anything, the house, the garden, the portfolio, the family name, is only the smallest portion of what actually sustains it. The sustaining work happens below the surface, in the dark, in the places that visitors do not see and heirs do not fully appreciate until they are gone. She had watched heirs not appreciate things for 60 years. She had drawn certain conclusions. The ledger entry for this morning is a small one, a quarterly premium on an insurance policy that most people would have cancelled years ago, the annual premium having long since exceeded any rational calculation of risk. She keeps it because it protects a specific collection of furniture and objects, the rosewood desk among them, that would be difficult to replace and impossible to value accurately, and because the habit of protection, once established, is harder to justify abandoning than to justify maintaining. She closes the ledger, she places the cap back on her pen. In 12 minutes, the rest of the house will begin to wake. There will be breakfast and the newspaper and the arrival of her granddaughter, who is coming today to ask about the trust arrangements in a way that will be phrased as curiosity, but will be, she already knows, something closer to hope. She has an answer prepared. She has had it prepared for several months since the day she recognized the direction of the conversation her granddaughter would eventually arrive at. It is a patient answer given with warmth that declines the request without appearing to decline anything at all. She has been giving that particular answer in its various forms for most of her adult life. There is, she has found, a certain comfort in patterns, in knowing before the conversation begins how it will end, in having prepared not just the answer but the manner of delivery, the cup of tea that will be offered, the shift in subject that will follow naturally enough that the refusal does not feel like a door closing, but simply like the conversation moving in its unhurried way to the next room. The morning light settles. The house holds its silence for a few moments more, and the old woman at her writing desk prepares, with perfect equanimity, for another day of keeping what she has always kept. Money, in its earliest form, is almost never old. It begins somewhere specific. It begins in a transaction, a discovery, a risk that paid out at the right moment in the right way. It begins with coal under the ground in the north, or cotton moving through a port in the south, or a ship that arrived intact when another man's ship did not. It begins with a decision made under pressure by someone who turned out to be right, not always because they were wiser than their contemporaries, but sometimes simply because they were alive in the correct decade for a particular kind of rightness to matter. The money comes first, the manners come after. This is a truth that old money families understand with an intimacy that they rarely discuss in public. The drawing rooms and the silver and the sense of unassailable propriety, all of that is the product of at least 2 generations of careful work that is quite different from the work that created the original fortune. Creating a fortune requires a certain kind of boldness, a willingness to act quickly and live with uncertainty, and accept that many things will not work out before one thing finally does. Maintaining a fortune across generations requires something almost opposite. It requires patience, repetition, and a deep and sometimes ruthless suspicion of bold action. The women who managed old money understood this better than the men did, and they understood it earlier. It is not a coincidence. Women of the class and era we are discussing were not, for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, permitted to generate wealth. They could not own property independently until the law changed. They could not sign contracts. They could not open accounts in their own names without the cooperation of a husband or a male relative. The mechanisms of accumulation were closed to them by legal design. What they could do, and what the best of them did with extraordinary skill, was preserve. Preservation is a different art from accumulation, and in some respects a more demanding one. Accumulation has a clear metric. The number goes up and you are winning, goes down and you are losing. Preservation is more complex. The fortune you are protecting exists within a context, a family, a set of relationships, a web of obligations and expectations and histories, and the context is always shifting. The heirs age and develop opinions, the economy changes direction, the tax laws are rewritten, the solicitor retires, the trusted banker moves to another firm. And the fortune itself, if it is not actively managed, does not merely stay still, it diminishes. This is the thing that heirs never quite believe until they have watched it happen, and that the women who managed fortunes understood in their bones from early in their adult lives. Money left to itself does not maintain itself. It leaks through 1,000 small openings. Mismanaged tenancies, underperforming investments, household expenses that have grown by habit rather than by decision, charitable donations that have calcified into obligations no one questions anymore. The leaking is always quiet. That is the danger of it. Consider the house, not any specific house, but the house as a category. The large, cold, beautiful, expensive house that anchors an old money family to its history and its geography and its sense of itself. The house costs money to heat, to staff, to maintain, to insure. The roof needs attention every generation. The plumbing is always either being replaced or needing to be. The garden requires either full-time care or visible decline, and visible decline is a statement the family cannot afford to make. The women who kept fortunes intact understood that the house was both an asset and a liability, and that which category it fell into depended entirely on the decisions made about it in any given decade. A house that was properly managed, its tenant farms kept in good repair, its London rooms let during the seasons when the family was elsewhere, its maintenance costs tracked against a sensible budget. Such a house paid for itself and something beyond. A house that was treated purely as an expression of family pride, staffed to a standard the income could not justify, maintained at a level that required selling something else to sustain. Such a house was a slow hemorrhage. The women who kept fortunes intact let no hemorrhage continue unaddressed. You may find yourself wondering what it looks like in practice to make that kind of decision, to look at a house you love, a house that holds your entire life's context, and see it clearly enough to say, this wing will be closed. These rooms will not be heated this winter. The third footman is a luxury we are not in a position to maintain. It looks, from the outside, like ruthlessness. From the inside, it looks like arithmetic. There is a woman who appears in the records of a Yorkshire estate in the 1880s. Her name is not important, or rather it is important in the local records of her county but unknown outside them, which is itself a kind of emblem of what her life was, whose husband died in 1881, leaving her with 4 children, a house of 40 rooms, a farming estate of 1,200 acres, and debts that amounted to roughly twice the annual income of the property. She was 43 years old. She had been to London twice in her adult life. The solicitor who came to explain the situation to her was not, by the standards of the time, unkind. He understood that he was delivering difficult news to a woman who had no professional training in financial matters and no network of peers who might help her navigate what lay ahead. He explained the numbers carefully. He outlined the options as he saw them: selling a portion of the estate, letting the house and living more modestly elsewhere, or negotiating with the creditors for a payment arrangement that would require strict austerity for a minimum of 10 years. She listened to him with the particular quality of attention that women of her type developed over a lifetime of being required to understand things without being expected to act on them. She asked 3 questions. She thanked him for his time. She showed him to the door herself because the footman was no longer employed there. And then she sat down and read every document he had brought with him. She had completed her reading by midnight. By the following morning she had identified 2 errors in the accounting that had been presented to her. Errors not of fraud, but of assumption. One concerning the rental value of the northern farms, which had been assessed at a rate below the current market, and one concerning an annuity that had been listed as an obligation, when it had in fact lapsed at her mother-in-law's death 3 years earlier. The correction of those 2 errors reduced the apparent debt by 1/3. She went to the solicitor's office herself the following week, which was not done. Women of her position did not go to solicitors' offices. They received solicitors in drawing rooms and accepted what was explained to them. She went to the office and presented her corrections with the documents that supported them, and sat quietly while the solicitor verified the figures, and arrived, with some visible discomfort, at the same conclusion she had reached. The debt was manageable, not comfortable, not easily resolved, but manageable. It was managed. Over the following 11 years, with a discipline that the solicitor described in a letter to a colleague as almost military, she reduced the estate's obligations to 0 and increased the working income of the farms by improving the tenancy agreements and investing in drainage work that the previous generation had deferred. When her eldest son came of age and took formal control of the property, he received not the diminished remnant of a drowning estate, but something that had been, in the most precise sense of the word, saved. He never fully understood what had been saved or from what. This was, in its way, part of the achievement. The women who managed fortunes rarely explained their management to the people who benefited from it. Explanation would have required the beneficiaries to understand the alternative, to see clearly what would have happened without the interventions, the small decisions made early, the quiet refusals, the hours at the desk before anyone else was awake. The beneficiaries did not want to see that. It was uncomfortable. It implied a dependence they preferred not to acknowledge. And so the women said nothing about it. They managed and were silent about their managing, and the fortune continued, and the heirs continued, and the drawing room stayed warm and the portraits hung on the walls, and nobody asked too carefully about the mechanism by which this was sustained. The mechanism was a woman at a desk reading numbers by candlelight and refusing to be moved from what the numbers told her. This pattern repeated across the centuries and across the classes of what we call old money, which is simply money that has survived long enough to forget where it came from. In England, it appeared in the management of landed estates by widowed countesses and baronesses whose husbands had been more interested in horses or politics than in the details of their own finances. In America, it appeared in the parlours of Boston and Philadelphia and New York, where the women who had married into the great mercantile and industrial fortunes of the 19th century outlived their husbands and discovered, with a combination of clarity and grief, that the fortune they had been decorating all their married lives now required actual stewardship. Not all of them were equal to it. Some were not inclined to try, and the fortunes that passed through those hands diminished in the way that water diminishes from a glass left on a warm windowsill, slowly by evaporation, until one day someone picks it up and finds almost nothing there. But the ones who were equal to it, the ones who sat down with the ledger and the solicitor's letters and the rental agreements and the investment portfolios and worked through them until they understood, those women performed a service of preservation that the history books have rarely recorded with anything like the attention it deserved. They did not think of it as remarkable. It was simply what needed to be done. The morning light in the Yorkshire drawing room, in the Boston parlour, in the New York townhouse where an old woman is finishing her tea and preparing to face a day that will include, among other things, a granddaughter with hopeful eyes and a request that will be declined with perfect courtesy. That light falls on the same objects it has always fallen on. The furniture stands in its long-established places. The portrait looks down from above the mantel with that expression of perfect composed authority. The fortune is still here because someone decided it would be. And that someone, in the great majority of the cases worth studying, was the oldest woman in the room. There was no school for this. There was no syllabus, no set of texts. No examination at the end that awarded the successful student a certificate of competence in the management of inherited wealth. The women who became the guardians of old money fortunes learned what they learned through a combination of methods that are difficult to categorize in any tidy way. Through observation, through necessity, through the very particular education that comes from sitting in rooms where important conversations are happening while everyone present has agreed, without discussing it, that you are not quite there. This is perhaps the most underappreciated form of education that has ever existed. To be present without being addressed, to hear the conversation about the estate's liabilities because you are the wife of the man being advised, and no one has thought to ask you to leave, and no one has thought to speak to you directly, and so you sit in your chair by the fire with your needlework and you listen, and you understand more of what you're hearing than anyone in the room suspects, and you file it away in the careful archive of your attention, where it will remain perfectly preserved until the day you need it. That day always came. The needlework was frequently used as a prop in these performances of attentive inattention. There is something about a woman occupied with needlework that renders her functionally invisible to men engaged in serious conversation. The hands move, the head is slightly bowed, the posture suggests absorption in the task, and meanwhile the ears are working, and the mind behind the slightly bowed head is categorizing and questioning and remembering with a precision that would have astonished the men whose conversation she was absorbing had they thought to consider it. They did not think to consider it. The knowledge that accumulated in this way was specific and practical. It was knowledge about how trusts were structured, because the solicitor had explained the trust to her husband in her presence, in language that assumed her incomprehension, and therefore did not bother with the condensations and simplifications that would have been offered to a direct inquiry. It was knowledge about the rental values of specific properties, because those conversations happened over dinner, and dinner was one of the few occasions when the business of the estate was discussed in mixed company. It was knowledge about which investments were performing and which were not, because her husband discussed these things with his brother on Sunday afternoons in the library, and the library door did not always close completely. A woman who had been gathering this kind of information for 20 or 30 years by the time her husband died arrived at widowhood with an education that was, in many respects, more comprehensive than her husband's own. He had received formal explanations of things, the kind of explanations tailored to the receiver, softened and simplified and organized for easy comprehension. She'd received the thing itself, the actual conversation between the man who knew and the man who needed to know, unmediated, unexpurgated in all its complexity and qualification. She had, in the most precise sense, been overhearing her own education for decades. There was also the education of the household. A large house, managed well, is a kind of economy in miniature, and the woman who managed it, who oversaw the accounts, negotiated with suppliers, managed the staff, maintained the inventory of linens and silver and wine, planned the meals for 2 weeks ahead to ensure nothing was wasted and nothing ran short. That woman had been running a small but complex operation every day of her adult life. The skills were more transferable than anyone acknowledged. Knowing how to negotiate with a butcher who has been overcharging for 6 months and knows you know it, but also knows that you value the relationship and the convenience and the quality, and so will want to resolve the situation in a way that neither party is embarrassed by. That skill is not so very different from knowing how to negotiate with a tenant farmer who is 3/4 behind on his rent and has 7 children and a wife who is unwell. The details are different. The underlying geometry of the conversation is identical. You have something they need. They have something you need. The question is how to arrive at an arrangement that both parties can accept, that resolves the immediate difficulty without poisoning the long-term relationship, and that leaves your position no weaker than it was before the problem arose, preferably slightly stronger. The household taught this. The household taught it every week. It also taught patience, which is perhaps the single quality most essential to the preservation of wealth, and the single quality most difficult to acquire by any method other than practice over time. Patience as an economic strategy means understanding that the correct response to most problems is not immediate action, but extended observation. That the tenant who is behind on his rent will, if given time and some quiet assistance, come right again, and that forcing the issue before that natural recovery happens will cost more in the long run, in bad feeling and empty fields and the difficulty of finding a replacement, than waiting and absorbing the short-term loss. Patience as a family strategy means understanding that the child who is currently making a series of decisions you find alarming, marrying someone you do not consider suitable, investing in something you consider unwise, spending at a rate you consider unsustainable, will, if given time and the quiet pressure of reality, come to understand what you have always understood, and that the alternative, confrontation, ultimatum, the decisive withdrawal of approval or support, will produce not correction but entrenchment, and will damage the relationship through which your influence passes. You wait, you watch, you remain available. And when the moment comes, and the moment always comes, you're there at the writing desk, with the document already prepared. There is a woman in the records of a Philadelphia family, a woman who appears as a footnote in the published history of the bank her father-in-law founded, and her husband theoretically ran, whose actual contribution to that bank's survival through the panic of 1893 has only recently been examined by financial historians with access to the private correspondence of the period. Her husband was not well. He had not been well since 1889, when a combination of exhaustion and anxiety had produced a condition that the physicians of the period described as nervous prostration, and that we might recognize as something closer to a complete psychological collapse. He was alive and present, nominally the head of the family and the institution, but the actual decisions, the ones that mattered, the ones that determined whether the bank would survive the contraction of credit that was sweeping through the American financial system in those years, were made by his wife. She made them in consultation with the bank's senior cashier, a man of 60 who had been with the institution for 40 years and who recognised with a clarity that his nominal superior's condition prevented him from matching, that the woman sitting across from him in the library understood the situation and would act on it. He told a colleague years later that she had the best financial mind he had encountered in 4 decades of banking. He said it as though he were confessing something embarrassing, which perhaps in 1893 he was. The decisions she made that year, reducing the bank's exposure to certain categories of real estate lending, maintaining reserve levels that other institutions were drawing down, declining to participate in a syndicate that 3 competing banks joined and subsequently lost catastrophically, preserved not just the bank but the family's entire position in the city. The bank's published history gives her husband credit for those decisions. The private correspondence gives it to her. The private correspondence is more persuasive. She never spoke publicly about what she had done. Her name appears in the official record only as the wife of the president, present at certain social events, contributor to certain charitable causes, dutiful and unremarkable in all the ways that women of her class were expected to be dutiful and unremarkable. The bank is still there. It operates under a different name now, having merged twice in the intervening century. But the thread of continuity runs back through those panicked months of 1893, through the decisions made in a library by a woman whose name the official history does not bother to learn. There is something quietly present in that kind of invisibility, not sad, not entirely, but something worth sitting with in the stillness of a late evening, when the mind is soft and the light has gone warm, and the sounds of the house have settled into their nighttime register of small familiar sounds, the tick of a clock, the faint movement of a radiator, the particular quiet that lives in old rooms. The women who kept the fortunes intact are not in the portraits that hang above the fireplaces of the institutions they saved. They are in the fact of the institution itself, in its continuity, in the thing that is still there when it might so easily not have been. That is a different kind of record, no less permanent for being invisible. A woman became, in the 19th century, most fully herself at the moment her husband died. This is not a comfortable observation, and the women whose lives it describes would have rejected it with considerable force had anyone been impolite enough to say it to them directly. They mourned, genuinely and deeply in most cases. The marriages that produced these remarkable widows were not, as a rule, loveless arrangements. They were the complicated, layered, compromised, and frequently tender bonds of 2 people who had built a shared life across several decades, and the loss of the other person was a loss that left a specific shape of absence in the house, in the daily schedule, in the small habits of companionship that accumulate almost invisibly over a long marriage until they are suddenly, irreversibly gone. They mourned, and they got on with it. Getting on with it was not a betrayal of grief. It was the same quality that had allowed them to manage the household through illness, through financial difficulty, through the deaths of children and the disappointments of children who did not die, but who did not become what their parents had hoped. Getting on with it was the thing they were made of. The grief was real. The getting on was also real. Both things existed at the same time, in the same woman, in the same house, and neither cancelled the other. What changed at widowhood practically was everything. Control of the fortune, which had been nominal in many marriages, experienced by the wife as something she managed in practice but never owned in principle, became actual. The trust arrangements, the investment portfolios, the property deeds, the decisions about what to sell and what to keep and where to invest the proceeds, all of it fell to her now, in a way that no polite fiction of consultation or delegation could obscure. She was the person whose signature went on the documents. She was the person to whom the solicitor directed his reports. She was the person who decided. Many women found this transition terrifying and thrilling in approximately equal measure. The terrifying part is obvious. The decisions that would previously have been made by someone else, or at least made with the comfort of appearing to have been made by someone else, were now entirely her own. The fortune that had always been there, managed by others while she decorated its surface, was now in her hands, and the responsibility was complete and personal in a way that drawing-room existence had never quite prepared her for. The thrilling part is less often discussed. It was the feeling of a door opening that had been closed so long you had forgotten it was there. It was the experience of being addressed directly, finally, by the solicitor and the banker and the estate agent. being asked your opinion and having it treated as the opinion that mattered, being given information that had previously been filtered through your husband's summary of it. It was the world becoming, at the age of 55 or 60 or 65, more legible than it had ever been, because you are now permitted to read it directly rather than through the translations of others. The women who had been quietly paying attention for decades were ready for this. They had been ready for years. The first decisions were often the most revealing, not because they were the largest, but because they were the ones made when the estate was still in its immediate post-death condition, the accounts unsettled, the will in probate, the various claims of creditors and relatives and institutions making themselves known all at once, in a period that was also supposed to be a period of mourning and withdrawal from ordinary life. A widow who could navigate that first year without making a significant error was a widow who would probably be fine. The errors that were made in first years were generally of the same type. They were the errors of deference, of trusting the solicitor who had advised the husband, and assuming that the advice given to the husband was advice appropriate to give to the widow, when in fact the two situations were quite different, and the solicitor's instinct was to manage the transition conservatively in ways that benefited the solicitor's continued role more than the widow's actual position. They were the errors of sentiment, keeping something that should have been sold because it had been loved by the person who was gone, without calculating what the cost of that sentiment would be over the next decade. They were the errors of confidence, acting too quickly on a plan that required more time to mature, or waiting too long out of uncertainty when the situation required immediate response. The women who made those errors often recovered from them. The fortune was usually large enough to absorb a first-year mistake without permanent damage. What the mistake cost was not primarily money, but time, and time in the management of inherited wealth is the resource you cannot manufacture. The women who did not make those errors, who arrived at the first meeting with the solicitor having already read the relevant documents, who asked the banker the 3 questions his answers would not address without prompting, who visited the northern property in the first month of their widowhood and saw with their own eyes what the estate agent's report had described in language designed to minimize alarm. Those women typically spent the first year not recovering from errors, but establishing the pattern of management that would define the next 30 years. 30 years, the length of a career, the length of a sustained institutional relationship, the length of time it takes to change substantially what a fortune is doing and where it is going. There is a woman who inherited the management of a Boston shipping interest in 1902, whose husband had built a significant position in the coastal trade over 20 years and left it to her at 61 with the confidence, expressed in his will in language that the other men in his business circle found touching, and perhaps slightly naive, that she would know what to do with it. She did know what to do with it. What she knew because she had been watching the shipping industry for 20 years from the drawing rooms and dinner tables, where her husband's colleagues discussed it with the frankness that men use when they believe the women present are not listening, was that the coastal trade was undergoing a structural shift. The railroads had been eating at it for 2 decades. The internal combustion engine was going to eat at it further. The industry was not dying exactly, but its nature was changing, and the changes were moving in directions that the men who had built their positions on the old assumptions were not reading clearly, partly from experience and partly from sentiment, and partly from the very natural human tendency to believe that what has worked for 20 years will continue to work. She had no sentiment about it. It was not her 20 years. Over the following 7 years, she sold the coastal trade positions at prices that seemed, at the time, unreasonably strong, and reinvested the proceeds in a diversified portfolio that included, among other things, a substantial position in electrical utilities that her husband's associates found when they heard about it, somewhat eccentric for a woman of her background. The electrical utilities were a very good investment. She was a very careful woman. By the time she reached 70, the fortune she had inherited was larger in real terms than it had been when it came to her, which is an outcome so rare in the first-generation transition of inherited wealth that it bears a moment of quiet consideration. Fortunes almost always diminish in the first generation after their creator. The widow who did not merely preserve but grew what she'd been given was doing something genuinely unusual, and she was doing it by methods that would not have been visible to anyone who glanced at her surface. The quiet Boston widow in her house on Beacon Hill, the respectable charitable donations, the unremarkable social calendar, the pearl necklace that had been her mother-in-law's. the pearl necklace, the ledger on the desk, the teacup at exactly the right temperature. The surface of these women's lives was so carefully maintained that it obscured entirely the nature of the activity occurring beneath it, which was perhaps the point. A woman who appeared to be nothing more than a well-preserved representative of her class was a woman whose decisions would not be challenged, whose instructions would be carried out without the resistance that announces itself when someone suspects the person giving instructions is operating outside their assigned role. She had been assigned no role, she had created her own, and the creation was invisible because the surface was so perfectly, so authentically what everyone expected to see. Every old fortune has a story about the heir who nearly ended it. Sometimes the story is about gambling, sometimes it is about drink, which is a different kind of gambling, the wager being placed against one's own body and one's own judgment, with odds that only grow worse over time. Sometimes it is about the business venture, the mine in South America, the railway scheme in the Middle West, the investment in a friend's certainty, that absorbed capital the way dry earth absorbs rain, quickly and completely, leaving the surface looking almost unchanged while the depth beneath has been seriously depleted. And sometimes the story is simply about the heir who inherited the name and the house and the social position, and not the quality of mind that had built and sustained the thing he was inheriting, and who spent 20 years demonstrating, through a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation, that the edifice could be dismantled piece by piece without any single act that could be pointed to as the moment it went wrong. The grandmothers who outlived their heirs had, in most cases, seen this coming from a long distance. They had seen it in the particular way a son held money, lightly, easily, as though it were a naturally occurring thing rather than a constructed one, as though its presence were a feature of the landscape rather than the result of specific decisions made across several generations. They had seen it in the friends he chose, in the clubs he joined, in the social world he moved through, with a confidence that was entirely real and entirely uninformed by any understanding of the mechanism that funded it. They had seen it in the questions he did not ask. A young man who asks questions about the source and structure of the family's wealth is a young man who can, with patient attention and the right guidance, become a capable steward of it. His curiosity is the beginning of understanding, and understanding, however imperfectly arrived at, is the first requirement of management. The young man who does not ask questions, who receives the quarterly dividends and the accountant's summary without interest, who nods politely when the solicitor comes to explain the trust arrangements, and then asks when they might be expected to go shooting, that young man requires a different kind of management. He requires a grandmother. Not to explain things to him necessarily. Explanation had been tried in most cases, across dinner tables and in libraries, with varying success and no permanent result. He would listen, nod, ask a question that demonstrated more courtesy than comprehension, and return the following season to the same habits and the same expenditure levels, and the same confident assumption that the fortune was a condition of existence rather than a product of sustained effort. What he required was a structure that protected the fortune from his best intentions and his worst impulses simultaneously, a trust arrangement that limited what he could access, and when, a property deed that encumbered sale with conditions he could not satisfy on a whim, an investment portfolio managed by people whose instructions came not from him, but from a document his grandmother had signed 20 years earlier, and which was, by design, extremely difficult to modify. The grandmothers who preserved fortunes were experts in the construction of these structures. They understood that the most durable protection is legal protection, not because family loyalty is worthless, but because family loyalty is subject to the pressures of the present moment in a way that a well-constructed trust is not. A son who loves you and whom you love will, under sufficient financial pressure, ask you to release capital from a protected structure, and if the love is real, and the request is urgent enough, and the reason is sympathetic enough, and the reasons were always sympathetic, always framed in terms of genuine need or reasonable opportunity, the mother's love will want to say yes, the trust says no, and because the trust says no, the mother does not have to be the one who refuses, and the love survives the refusal in a way it might not have survived if the refusal had come from the mother herself. This was, in its way, a form of kindness. The structure protected the heir from having to make the relationship into a financial negotiation. It protected the grandmother from having to choose between the fortune and the love. It protected both of them by making the decision elsewhere, in the document, in the long-ago deliberate act of a woman who had looked at the situation clearly, before sentiment entered the room. There are families in England whose estates survived the 20th century largely intact because a widow in the 1890s or 1900s took advantage of a window in the law to settle the property into a trust arrangement that was, by the standards of her own financial situation, extremely conservative, and that her children found deeply frustrating, and that her grandchildren were grateful for in a way they could not quite articulate, and that her great-grandchildren simply took for granted as the condition of their inheritance without ever knowing what it had been designed to protect against. 4 generations downstream from the decision, nobody remembers that it was a decision. It feels like nature. It feels like the way the estate simply is. The fact that the way it is was chosen, deliberately and with considerable legal sophistication, by a woman sitting at a rosewood desk in the lamplight of a winter evening, reading documents that her husband had never thought to read. That fact has been absorbed into the general texture of the family's past and is indistinguishable from it. This is not ingratitude exactly. It is simply the nature of effective preservation. When something is perfectly maintained, it does not announce its maintenance. The roof that never leaks is not thought about. The trust that never releases inappropriate capital is not discussed. The woman who designed both is not celebrated, because celebration requires contrast, requires the awareness of what might have been, and that awareness is precisely what successful preservation prevents. There is something gently circular in all of this, the way a well-told story circles back to its beginning without quite closing, the way a garden returns every spring to roughly the same arrangement of colour and form while being, at the cellular level, entirely renewed. She wrote the document to protect against a future she could clearly imagine. The future arrived and the document held. The future never knew what it was being protected from. The protection was the thing that worked. The heir who nearly ended the fortune is a story that every old family has. The grandmother who prevented it is a story that fewer families know how to tell. Not because it is less interesting, but because the prevention left no wreckage to point to, only the quiet, unremarkable fact of continuity, of the thing still being there when it might so easily not have been. You may find yourself thinking of something you have quietly preserved, some arrangement or habit or relationship that continues because someone once decided it would, and that decision has been so thoroughly absorbed into the ordinary texture of your days that you have long since stopped seeing the decision in it, only the fact. That is what the grandmothers left behind, not monuments, facts. A house of a certain age holds its past in ways that the people living in it rarely notice. It is in the particular sound a specific stair makes, not a creak exactly, but a soft compression, a note in the bass register of the house's daily music, that every member of the household knows without knowing they know it, that has been there for 60 years, that the grandmother notices is absent when someone has replaced the stairboard without telling her. It is in the way the East drawing room smells in November, something that involves wood smoke and beeswax and a particular quality of cold coming through the window frame that was never quite properly sealed after the replacement in 1947. It is in the angle of the afternoon light through the hall windows in late September, a very specific golden quality that lasts for perhaps 3 weeks of the year, and that makes the house look, for those 3 weeks, exactly the way it looked in a painting done in 1881 that hangs at the turn of the stair. She knows all of this. She's known it for 60 years. The house is not just a building to her. This is the most obvious thing to say about an old woman in an old house, and therefore the thing most easily overlooked. The house is a record, the most complete and detailed record of her adult life that exists anywhere, and she moves through it with the fluency of someone reading in their native language, understanding layers of meaning in objects and arrangements, and small atmospheric details that a visitor would simply experience as charm or atmosphere, or the vague, pleasant weight of age. The visitor sees a beautiful old house. She sees every decision that made it what it is, and every decision she still has to make to keep it that way. The decisions about a house of this age are never simple. They are layered with history, with sentiment, with competing claims of practicality and beauty, and the obligation to the past that old houses generate in the people who inhabit them. The roof is always either being fixed or needing fixing. The wiring has been replaced twice, inadequately both times, and will need to be replaced again before the decade is out. The kitchen wing, which was extended in 1923 by her mother-in-law in a manner that made practical sense at the time, but has become a source of ongoing structural complications, requires attention that the budget can accommodate, but only if something else is deferred. She makes these decisions herself, not entirely alone. There is an architect she has trusted for 20 years, a builder whose family has been working on the house for 3 generations, an estate manager who has been with the property since her husband's time, and who has the particular quality of loyal competence, that is, in the management of old houses, worth more than any formal qualification. But the decisions are hers. She has the final word on everything, not because she insists on it, but because the house requires it, requires a single consistent intelligence that holds its entire history in mind when any specific question arises. A building like a fortune cannot be preserved by committee. The great houses of England, the ones that survived the 20th century with their character more or less intact, were in the majority of cases sustained through their most difficult decades by women in exactly this position. The men who had built them or inherited them were gone, to the wars, to early deaths, to the particular kind of dissipation that the Edwardian era offered with such generous variety. And the women who remained made the decisions, which rooms to close, which wings to let, which contents to sell and which to keep, how to negotiate with the government over requisitioning during the wars, how to reopen afterward on a budget that bore no resemblance to the budget on which the house had previously operated. These were not small decisions. Each of them was irreversible in its own way. A room that is closed for a season can be reopened. A room that is closed for 20 years develops problems. Content sold in one generation cannot be bought back in the next, or can only be bought back at a cost so great that the exercise itself becomes evidence of the original sale's permanence. The character of a house, which is the sum of everything that is in it, and everything that has happened in it, and every smell and sound and quality of light that has accumulated across its years. That character can be damaged in a decade and cannot be restored in a century. The women who kept houses intact understood this in a cellular way. They made the decisions that preserved the character because they inhabited the character, because they were continuous with it in a way that made its loss not an abstract financial problem, but a personal diminishment, the loss of a part of their own self, the part that was located not inside them, but around them, in the rooms and objects and arrangements that constituted the physical record of everything they had been. There is a house in Wiltshire, still inhabited, still essentially as it was, whose survival through the second half of the 20th century is attributable in large part to the decisions made by its owner between 1951 and 1987. She inherited it at 42 from a husband who had been a good man and a bad manager of property, whose approach to the house had been one of benign occupation rather than active stewardship, who had loved the house without understanding the work that love required. The death duties at his death nearly ended it. They were substantial, falling due in a period of economic difficulty, payable in a time frame that seemed, to the solicitors involved, to allow no alternative to a sale. She found the alternative. She found it through a combination of methods that each required a different kind of courage, the courage to negotiate, the courage to wait, the courage to make a temporary arrangement that felt like surrender, but was, in its actual operation, the opposite. She led a portion of the house to a school for 3 years, which provided income but required accepting the presence of 60 adolescent strangers in the wing she most associated with her children's early lives. She sold the London flat, which was an easier decision financially and a harder one emotionally. She negotiated a payment schedule for the death duties that the Revenue Office accepted with visible reluctance, and that she met without a single missed quarter. The school vacated the house in 1954. The death duties were paid in full by 1956. The house returned to itself, or rather returned to her, which was, for practical purposes, the same thing. She lived there until 1987, a period of 36 years during which she made the decisions that the house required, and deferred the decisions that it could afford to wait on, and refused the decisions that would have changed its fundamental character, however large the sum that was offered in exchange for them. The offers came. They always came. The house was beautiful and the land was valuable, and there were always people who believed that their particular use of it would be a higher use, a better use, a more productive use than the use of simply keeping it as it was and living in it and being the person around whom it organised itself. She disagreed. She disagreed politely at length with excellent reasons, and the house is still there. The rooms are cool now, this evening, in the way that stone houses are cool even in summer, the walls having absorbed a winter's worth of cold and releasing it slowly across the warmer months in a way that is either uncomfortable or refreshing depending on where you have come from. The light through the west windows is long and golden in the way September light is, and the sounds of the house are the sounds that have always been its sounds. The soft complaint of old floorboards, the distant movement of air through chimney stacks that haven't had fires in them since spring. The particular silence that old houses hold at the end of the day when the last of the daylight is going and the night has not yet fully arrived. In the east drawing room, above the fireplace, a portrait looks down with composed and certain eyes. The woman in the portrait has been here longer than anyone alive. She is still keeping watch. The most powerful word in the vocabulary of the women who kept fortunes intact was a word of one syllable that they rarely used directly. They did not say no the way the word appears on its own, blunt and final and productive of the kind of resistance that a clean refusal almost always generates. They said something that meant no, that had the full legal and practical force of no, that achieved everything no would have achieved, and that did so in a way that left the person being refused with the feeling that the conversation had been helpful and warm, and that they had been genuinely heard, which they had, though not in the way they intended. This was a skill of considerable sophistication. It had been developed across decades of navigating the specific social terrain that women of their class inhabited, a terrain in which direct statement was frequently considered aggressive, and indirection was the expected and accepted mode of communication for any subject that carried weight. They were expert practitioners of indirection in its highest form, which is not evasiveness but precision, the ability to say exactly what you mean while using language that does not alarm the listener into the defensive posture that would prevent them from hearing it. The long no operated across several time frames simultaneously. In the immediate conversation, it sounded like engagement. It involved careful listening, the asking of questions that demonstrated the listener's genuine interest in the speaker's situation, the acknowledgement of the difficulty or urgency that had prompted the request. It might conclude with a general agreement that the matter deserved further thought, which it did, had done, was receiving right now as the grandmother filed the request against the existing architecture of her plans and confirmed for the 100th time that the answer had not changed. In the medium term, the no materialized as a series of gentle obstacles. The solicitor needed to be consulted. The trust documents required review. There was a specific clause that made the proposed action complicated in ways that would require careful navigation. These obstacles were real because she had designed them to be real years earlier, in anticipation of exactly this kind of conversation. The trust document had the clause because she had put it there. The solicitor was not available this week because she had spoken to him on Tuesday, and he understood what she needed him to be unavailable for. In the long term, the no was simply the fact of what did not happen. The sale that was not made, the capital that was not released, the structure that remained intact through the period when it was under the most pressure, and that was still intact a decade later when the urgency that had felt so compelling had either resolved itself or been revealed as less consequential than it had appeared. She was patient. She was very patient. The patience was not passive. This is the thing most often misunderstood about the long no. It was not waiting in the sense of simply allowing time to pass. It was active management of time, the deliberate extension of a situation that did not require immediate resolution across a timeline in which its own resolution became available. A son who wants capital released from a trust to invest in a friend's business venture will, if the release is deferred long enough, encounter one of two outcomes. Either the venture will succeed and he will no longer need the capital, or it will fail and he will be grateful eventually that the capital was never released. Both outcomes are satisfactory from the grandmother's perspective. Neither requires her to be the person who refused. Time did the refusing. She simply managed the interval. This is not manipulative in the sense that word implies bad faith. It is manipulative in the older sense, dexterous, skilled, working with material. The material is time and the human tendency to allow urgency to fade when it is not fed by immediate response. She fed nothing, she managed everything. There were cases, of course, where patience was not sufficient, where the request was not for capital from a trust, but for a decision that required her direct response, a matter of the estate's governance, a question of family policy, a situation in which someone was pressing for a confrontation rather than a deferral. In those cases, the long no became the short no, and the difference in delivery was startling. A woman who has spent 30 years being warm and patient and indirect accumulates, in the people who know her, an assumption of those qualities that functions as a kind of credit. They have come to expect the warmth and the patience, and the expectation makes the absence of both, when she chooses to remove them, considerably more emphatic than it would be in a person who deployed bluntness routinely. A woman who is sometimes sharp is predictable. A woman who is always warm until she's not is something else entirely. The moment when the long no became the short no was described by the people who witnessed it as a change in atmosphere, a very sudden and specific drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the particular quality of attention that the old woman directed toward the person who had pushed too hard, or asked too directly, or attempted to negotiate a position she had not offered for negotiation. The smile did not disappear. The voice did not rise. But something was gone from the room, some quality of ease, and in its absence the room felt suddenly and completely different. It was, in the recollections of those who experienced it, not frightening, not quite, but it was absolute. It communicated with perfect clarity that the conversation had arrived at its end, that the position being stated was the position, that no further pressure would produce any result other than the permanent deterioration of the relationship through which all future requests would need to pass. Nobody pushed past it, not twice. The paradox at the centre of this particular skill, and it is a genuine paradox, one worth turning over slowly in the mind as the evening settles and the sounds of the house grow quieter, and the quality of the light through the windows becomes the deep amber of late evening, is that the most powerful no is the one that feels to the person receiving it like something other than a no. It feels like time. It feels like the pace at which things naturally unfold. It feels like the structure of the world, or the structure of the trust agreement, or the considered judgment of the solicitor, or the current state of the investment market. It feels like everything except a single person's decision, which is precisely what it is. She decided years ago that this would be how things were. She built the structures that would make it so. She inhabits those structures with such naturalness, such genuine comfort, that they do not feel like structures to anyone who encounters them from the outside. They feel like the way the world happens to be arranged. It is a long way to know, but it holds. She buried a husband and 2 children before she turned 70. The details of these losses are private in the way that the deepest losses are always private, not because they were hidden, but because they were too large to be properly contained in any public form of expression, and the attempts to contain them publicly always felt to her like a reduction of something that deserved more than reduction. She wept, in private. She did not speak about it, except once to her youngest daughter, in a conversation that lasted 3 hours and that both of them understood, without discussing, would never be referred to again. She went back to the desk. The desk was not a refuge in the sense of an escape from grief. She did not sit down at the rosewood desk and find that the column of numbers erased the fact of what she had lost. The numbers were always there, and the grief was always there, and the two existed in the same room, at the same time, without one cancelling the other. What the desk gave her was not relief from feeling, but direction for action, a structure into which she could pour the portion of her attention that grief did not require, so that she was not simply sitting in the fact of the loss with nowhere for the rest of herself to go. This is a distinction that the people who knew her only from the outside would not have appreciated. They saw a woman who recovered quickly, who did not linger, who returned to the management of her affairs with a speed that might have seemed to some observers like a failure of appropriate grief. They were wrong about this. The recovery was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of purpose. She had things to do. The doing of them did not mean she was not also grieving. Both were true simultaneously, as both things were always true in her simultaneously, the private and the practical, the feeling and the deciding. Old money families are not, as a rule, skilled at talking about grief. The culture that produced them, the culture of restraint and discretion, and the firm conviction that the private world should stay private, was not a culture that encouraged the kind of open, extended processing of loss that later decades would come to consider healthy and necessary. They processed in other ways. They worked. They maintained their routines. They honoured the dead by continuing to do the things the dead had cared about, managing the estate that the dead had loved, tending the garden that the dead had planted, ensuring that the institution, or the fortune, or the family itself remained what it had been before the loss, as though the best memorial were the thing that survived unchanged. This was, in its way, its own kind of grief, wearing the clothes of continuity. When her second son died at 42, a sudden and not entirely shocking death, the signs having been present for several years in the form of a way of living that burned too bright and too fast, and that she had watched with the quiet anxiety of a mother who could see clearly and could not intervene, she did several things in the weeks that followed. She attended to the funeral, which was large, because he had been a sociable man and well-liked, and the church overflowed with people who had genuinely cared for him. She managed the correspondence, which was voluminous. She received the visitors, which was tiring. She was appropriately present for his wife and his children, in the measured, steady way that she was present for everything. And she revised the trust arrangements. Not immediately. The revision came 3 months later, after the immediate requirements of the loss had been met and she'd had time to sit with the changed situation and understand its implications. Her son's death had altered the distribution of the family's assets in ways that needed to be addressed, and the addressing of them required thought about a horizon that extended well past her own death, into the lives of grandchildren who were currently young enough that their own characters and capacities were still forming. She wrote a document of considerable length, in collaboration with the solicitor, that restructured the long-term settlement in ways that accounted for what she now knew about the family's vulnerabilities and strengths. The document was precise and unsentimental and kind in the way that all the best legal structures are kind, in the way that a wall is kind to the thing it protects, not by softening it, but by holding firm. Her son's children are adults now. The arrangements their grandmother made in the winter of her grief are the arrangements within which they conduct their financial lives. They find these arrangements, as all inheritors find the structures they inherit, sometimes constraining and sometimes reassuring and almost always opaque in ways that make their grandmother's reasoning difficult to reconstruct. They do not know what she knew about their father. They do not know what she was protecting them from, in the particular form in which she thought the protection was most necessary. They know only the arrangement, the fact of it, the way it is. She made the arrangement, and the arrangement outlasted her, and the children of the man she was mourning have lives that are materially better for the document she wrote in the months when she was also, privately and genuinely, undone by grief. There is something worth holding in that. The idea that the most lasting acts are sometimes the ones performed in the worst conditions, not when everything is calm and the thinking is easy and the decisions feel light and reversible, but in the difficult periods, the grieving periods, the periods when a lesser woman might have allowed the weight of feeling to displace the capacity for action, and instead sat down at the desk and opened the ledger and picked up the pen. The pen is still in the desk drawer, the desk is still in the corner of the room. Outside the window the yew hedge stands in the dark, 14 feet of patient growth, exactly where she planted it in a spring that was also a spring of difficulty, a spring she was getting through, a spring in which the act of planting something that would take 20 years to reach its full height was its own kind of statement about the future. She planted it and it grew. She wrote the documents and they held. She grieved and she continued, and the continuation was not a betrayal of the grief but the other side of it, the face of love that looks forward instead of back, that says, this will remain, because of what was lost, because of who they were, because that is what the love requires now. She arrives on a Tuesday, which is deliberate. Tuesday is the day the grandmother has always been most available. The appointments are fewer, the morning correspondence dispatched before noon, the afternoon kept relatively clear for what the old woman, in the formality of habit, still calls receiving. The granddaughter has known this since childhood. She's sat in these rooms on Tuesday afternoons since she was 7 years old. She knows the sound of the house in the afternoon, the particular quality of the light through the west windows, the smell of the flower arrangement in the hall that the housekeeper changes on Monday mornings. She is 29. She's been preparing for this conversation for approximately 6 months. The preparation shows, though not in the way the granddaughter intends. What shows is not confidence, but its imitation, a careful management of posture and tone and the rate at which words are delivered that suggests someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say and is now performing the rehearsed version rather than simply speaking. The grandmother notices this. She noticed it from the moment her granddaughter walked into the room. She does not mention it. She pours the tea herself. The conversation begins, as these conversations always begin, with the general. How is the granddaughter's work? She is something in finance, which the grandmother approves of in principle, even if she has occasional reservations about the specific institution. How is the granddaughter's flat, the one in Battersea that the grandmother helped with the deposit for and about which she has certain architectural opinions she has expressed twice and allowed to rest? How is the young man, who's become a more permanent fixture in the granddaughter's life, and who is, the grandmother has decided, more capable than he initially appeared? The granddaughter answers each of these questions with the warmth and specificity of someone who has remembered that her grandmother prefers actual information to social performance. This is a good quality. The grandmother notes it. And then, after perhaps 20 minutes of this, 20 minutes of tea and general warmth and the specific Tuesday afternoon quality of light that both of them have been sitting in this room for 22 years, the granddaughter sets her cup down and begins. She has been thinking, she says, about the long-term structure of things, about the trust arrangement, about whether the current structure is the best possible structure for the generation it will eventually serve. She has been reading, she says, and here she mentions a book and 2 articles which she has genuinely read, and this is another good quality, that she does her homework, about how similar arrangements have been updated in other families to reflect the changed circumstances of the current financial environment. She's good, the grandmother thinks. She's genuinely good. The proposal, when it arrives, is specific and has clearly been thought through. She wants to understand whether a portion of the trust's capital, not all of it, she's careful to say just a portion, might be made available for direct investment rather than held in the existing arrangement. She has ideas about where that capital might go. She has figures. She has read the trust documents, or enough of them to know what she does not know, and she has brought questions about the parts she could not access. The grandmother listens for the full length of this presentation. She asks 3 questions. The first concerns the timeline the granddaughter has in mind. The second concerns the specific investment vehicles she's considering. The third is a question about a clause in the trust document that the granddaughter has not read because it is in a schedule attached to the original deed and is not typically included in the summary documents. The granddaughter does not know about the clause. The grandmother explains it in terms that are helpful and precise, and that make clear, without stating it directly, that the clause makes the proposed action more complicated than the granddaughter had understood, and that the complication is real, and that navigating it would require the participation of the solicitor, who would need to be consulted, and who has a limited schedule over the next several months. The granddaughter nods. She is absorbing. She is recalibrating. She is, the grandmother thinks, going to be fine. Not because she has accepted the no, though she has accepted it, because it is in the structure and the structure holds, and the grandmother did not need to say no at all. The architecture said it for her. She's going to be fine because she came prepared, because she read the documents, because she brought questions, because she is asking about structure rather than simply asking for release, which suggests she is thinking about the long game rather than the immediate gain. These are the qualities that allow a fortune to survive a generation. These are the qualities the grandmother has been watching for, in this granddaughter and in the others, since they were old enough to have qualities worth watching for. The Tuesday afternoon light moves through its last phase and becomes the particular gold of early evening. The flower arrangement in the hall is still fresh. The house is quiet around them, the same quiet it has maintained all afternoon. The grandmother pours more tea. She begins to talk, not about the trust which has been addressed, but about the history of the arrangement, how it came to be structured as it is, the decisions that shaped it, and the reasons for those decisions, the specific instances in which the structure had done what it was designed to do. She speaks of these things in the way she rarely speaks of them, in some detail, with the names and dates that make the abstract specific and real. The granddaughter listens. She has stopped performing. She's simply here, in this room, on a Tuesday afternoon, hearing the history of the structure she will one day inherit. She is taking notes, in her own way, in the archive of her attention. The grandmother sees this. Something in her settles, very quietly, like a door that has been slightly open finding its latch at last. She is not finished yet. She has more work to do, more documents to write, more decisions to make in the early morning at the rosewood desk. But this conversation, this particular Tuesday afternoon, has told her something she did not know with certainty until today. The thing will continue. Not because it is a fortune exactly, though it is that. Not because it is a house, though the house will stand. But because the quality of attention that built it and maintained it and protected it across the years is going to pass to the next person, transmitted not through a trust deed but through an afternoon of tea and careful listening and the deliberate disclosure of what has been kept private for a long time. She folds her hands in her lap. She sits with her usual straightness. The gold light holds for another moment. Then it begins, almost imperceptibly, to shift. There is a room in the east wing that has not changed substantially since 1934. The furniture is the furniture that was there then, a writing table of no particular distinction, 2 upholstered chairs whose fabric has been replaced once, a set of bookshelves along the north wall that hold the same volumes they have always held, organised in a system that is not alphabetical and not chronological, but is instead the system of a specific person's mind, a logic that was perfectly clear to the person who arranged them, and is now decipherable only to someone who has spent enough time in this room to understand the arranging intelligence behind it. She spent enough time, she knows where everything is. The room is called the morning room, though morning was never its primary use. It was used principally for the work that did not require a formal setting, for correspondence that was personal rather than official, for reading that was not for display, for the long unhurried sessions of thinking that she undertook without any specific goal other than the thinking itself, following the thread of a problem through its various implications until she arrived at a clarity she could act on. She did most of her best thinking in this room. The bookshelves hold a collection that reflects the range of what interested her, which was wide and specific at the same time. The estate management manuals sit alongside novels, the legal references sit near the travel books. There is a shelf of history, English and European primarily, that has been added to slowly across 70 years in the small increments of a reader who buys books carefully and keeps them all. There is a shelf of what might be called family history, though the term is inexact, a collection of documents and letters and account books and diaries, some bound and some loose, that represents the family's record of itself across 3 centuries. She is the person who has most thoroughly read this shelf. Not systematically in the way of an archivist, but gradually across decades, picking up a volume when it seemed relevant to something she was thinking about, reading enough to find the information she was looking for, and reading further because the reading itself was interesting, because the lives recorded there were interesting, because the decisions of the people who preceded her were interesting, because understanding how the thing had been managed before was useful to understanding how to manage it now. She knows the history of the fortune better than anyone. She knows it the way she knows the house, not as a catalogue of facts, but as a living thing, with a character and a direction, and a set of tendencies that she has learned to work with rather than against. This is part of the inventory. The inventory she's taking now, this quiet evening, is not a financial one, though she will make a financial one before the year is out as she makes one every year. This is a different kind. It is the kind you make when you are old enough to understand that the thing itself, the house, the fortune, the family name, the morning room with its unchanged furniture and its bookshelves and its specific quality of winter light, will outlast you, not by accident, by design. She has designed it to outlast her. That was always the point. The designing was done in layers, the way a garden is designed in layers. The immediate planting for this season's colour, the slow-growing element that will not reach its full form for 20 years, the structural work beneath the soil that determines what is possible for everything that grows above it. She has been designing across all 3 layers simultaneously for most of her adult life, which means that the full implication of some of the earliest decisions she made is only now becoming visible. the way the yew hedge she planted in 1961 only reached 14 feet in the last decade. The trust arrangements she made in the 1980s are now performing exactly the function she designed them to perform, which is the function of keeping the capital intact through the period when the heirs are in early middle age, and that they're most likely to have compelling reasons to request its release. The property arrangements she made in the 1990s have protected the house from the category of claim that she identified then as the most likely threat. The conversations she's now having, with solicitors, with the granddaughter, with the estate manager who will retire in 2 years and whose replacement she has been thinking about for 18 months, are the final layer of a structure that began being built before the people she is building it for were born. She finds this satisfying in a way that is difficult to explain and does not particularly require explanation. It is the satisfaction of a craftsperson looking at the thing they have made, the satisfaction of work done well, the satisfaction of a garden in its late-season fullness, the accumulated beauty of decisions that were made in all weathers and all moods over a very long time, and that have produced in their combined effect something that is more than the sum of what went into it. The fortune is larger now in real terms than when it came to her, not dramatically so, not in the way that a successful speculation might make it larger, but solidly so, in the way that patient management over 50 years makes something larger, the slow accretion of good decisions, the absence of catastrophic ones, the reinvestment of income and the careful management of expenditure, and the decision, made again and again in the face of various pressures, to hold rather than to sell. The house is intact. The morning room is as it was. The bookshelves hold their books in their specific legible order. Outside, the yew hedge stands against the darkening sky. The evening is settling now, the kind of evening that arrives in late September, and has a particular quality of stillness, the year beginning to gather itself in, the light withdrawing slowly from the garden and the fields beyond it, in a way that is not sad but is conclusive, a daily completion of something that began in the early morning when she was at her desk, and the light was just deciding what colour to be. She's been awake since 5:30. She will sleep now, or she will sit here for a while longer in the comfortable dark, with the house around her and the archive of her decisions present in every room, in every arrangement, in every document filed in every drawer, in the specific sound of the stair and the particular smell of November in the east drawing-room, and the weight of the pearls against her collarbone. Everything is as it should be. Everything she built is still standing. She closes her eyes. The names that appear on the buildings are almost always men's names. The library named for the grandfather, the hospital wing endowed in memory of the patriarch, the portrait in the boardroom of the man who founded the institution, hung at a height that requires you to look up at it, which was, one suspects, not accidental. The names are carved in stone and set in brass and printed in the programs of the galas held to celebrate the institutions they fund, and they are men's names, and the reasons for this are not mysterious. The money in the 19th century and for much of the 20th passed through male hands. It was generated by men in most cases, and it was formerly held by men, and the charitable disbursements that created the buildings and the institutions and the named gifts were authorized by men, and so it is men's names on the walls. But the money that was there to disperse, in many of the most significant cases, was there because a woman had kept it there. This is not a small caveat, it is the central fact of the history. The endowment that funds the reading room was made by a man who had the money to make it, because his mother had managed the family's affairs with sufficient skill through the difficult decades of the 1890s and the first decade of the new century to ensure that there was still a fortune to endow anything. The hospital wing was possible because a woman who never appeared in the Foundation's official history had, over 30 years, grown the fortune from which the gift was made. The portrait in the boardroom looks down on an institution that would not exist without the work of the woman who does not appear in the boardroom at all. The woman is usually in the portrait in the east drawing room, the one with the pearls and the composed expression and the hands folded in the lap, the one that visitors find beautiful and slightly intimidating without being entirely sure why. The why is precision. The why is the quality of someone who has looked at every financial document that passed through the family for 50 years and understood each of them fully before setting it down. The why is the quality of someone who has refused, consistently and without drama, to be moved from a position she had reached through careful thought, by the application of charm or urgency, or the emotional pressure of family need. The painting captures that quality better than the painter probably intended. The subject allowed the painter to see it, which was itself a decision. A woman of her particular skill knew exactly what she chose to reveal. The history of old money is full of these women. They appear in the margins of the official record, mentioned in wills as the trusted executor, noted in letters as the person whose opinion was sought before any major decision, described by contemporaries in the private correspondence that the public record does not include as the one who really understood how things worked, the one you went to when you needed something actually done. They are the women whose names appear in the genealogies without footnotes, listed as wives and mothers, their dates of birth and death the only data the record considered worth preserving. And yet the record also shows, for those willing to look at it carefully, that the decades during which these women were active as managers and stewards were consistently the decades in which the family's fortunes held or grew, while the decades before and after, when men of varying capacity were nominally in charge, were the decades in which the most significant losses occurred. Correlation, a careful historian would say, is not causation. True. But the correlation is persistent enough, and the examples numerous enough, and the private correspondence, when it survives, direct enough, that the conclusion seems reasonable. The women who managed these fortunes were managing them, and the results reflected the management. There is a particular family whose American branch survived the Depression largely intact, while the English branch, under the management of a male cousin who was good-natured and sociable, and entirely unsuited to the financial realities of the 1930s, lost most of what it had. The divergence is almost perfectly explicable by the difference in management. The American branch was in the hands of a woman who had been effectively running it since 1921. The English branch was in the hands of a man who genuinely believed, until the evidence became unavoidable, that the difficulties were temporary and would resolve themselves if he maintained his accustomed pace of life and waited for conditions to improve. Conditions did not improve quickly enough. She, across the Atlantic, did not wait for conditions. She sold what needed to be sold, reduced what needed to be reduced, invested in what would perform in the conditions that existed rather than the conditions she wished existed, and arrived at the far side of the Depression decade with the fortune diminished but functional, with the core holdings intact, with the structure of the thing preserved in its essential character, even if the surface had changed. The English cousins branch recovered eventually, over the following generation with considerable effort. But it was a recovery, which means starting from a point below the original. The American branch's preservation meant starting from a point close to where it had been. The compound interest on that difference across the following 50 years is substantial. You could track it in ledger entries. You could measure it in buildings that were kept and buildings that were sold. You could see it in the difference between a family that spent the second half of the 20th century consolidating from loss and a family that spent it building from continuity. The person who made the continuity possible is a woman whose name you would not recognize. She appears in no histories of the Depression. She received no recognition for what she did, because what she did was not considered remarkable at the time. It was considered, to the extent that it was considered at all, the competent management of a household's financial affairs by its temporarily available responsible adult. A woman who happened to be in the right position at the right time and who did what the situation required. That is, of course, exactly what she did, and the modesty of the description should not obscure the scale of the achievement. She did what the situation required. She did it with precision and patience, and the deep, specific knowledge of someone who had been paying careful attention for 30 years. She did it without drama, without recognition, and without any particular expectation of either. The fortune survived because she was there. The name on the building is someone else's, but the building is there because of her. Everything in an old house has a price. The question is not whether it has a price, but whether that price will ever be paid. This is a distinction that the women who managed fortunes understood with an intimacy that their heirs rarely matched. An heir looks at a painting and sees a family possession, something that has always been there, something whose presence is part of the background of existence. The grandmother who has kept it looks at the painting and sees what she paid for it, not in money necessarily, but in what it cost her to keep it when the pressure to sell was at its greatest. The pressure to sell was always at its greatest during the bad decades, the 20s for some families, the 30s for many, the 60s and 70s for the English families whose land values had been declining steadily since the agricultural depression of the late 19th century, and whose house maintenance costs bore no rational relationship to the income the houses generated. There were always people who would buy. There were always circumstances that made selling seem like the sensible, the responsible, the only realistic response to the current situation. She had looked at those circumstances with clear eyes and decided each time what to sell and what to keep. What to sell? The duplicates. The second-best silver that had been accumulating since the 1840s in a pantry where it was never used. The London flat that had been more useful to the generation before and was now primarily a maintenance cost and a temptation for relatives who needed a place to stay for longer than was wise. The outlying parcel of land that had never integrated comfortably with the rest of the estate and whose tenants had been problematic for 20 years. The investments that had been sensible in 1910 and were no longer sensible in 1960 held more from inertia than from any continuing logic. What to keep? The things that could not be replaced. The paintings that had been in the family since the 18th century, whose value was not primarily financial, or rather, whose financial value was real but secondary to the value of their continuity, the fact of their being exactly where they had always been, in the rooms they had been made for, the library, the correspondence archive, which had no market value and immense historical value, and which she had, at her own expense, had professionally organised and stored in conditions that would preserve it for the next century. The specific objects whose presence in the house made it what it was, the morning-room writing table, the set of bookshelves with their particular logic, the portrait in the east drawing-room above the fireplace. She was not sentimental about selling what needed to be sold. She was precise about what needed to be kept. The distinction between sentiment and precision is one that the history books rarely draw clearly, but it is the central distinction in the management of old money. A sentimental keeper holds on to everything, unable to see any object as expendable, treating the fortune as a museum of its own past, adding costs without reducing them, allowing the weight of accumulation to become its own kind of burden. A precise keeper understands that preservation requires selection, that keeping everything is paradoxically a way of keeping nothing, because the cost of maintaining everything dilutes the capacity to maintain any individual thing well. She kept what she kept because she had thought carefully about what the future required, not what the past contained, what the future required. The future, as she understood it, required a house that could be maintained on the income of the estate without constant emergency decisions. It required a portfolio that generated returns appropriate to the risk level of a family with no capacity to recover from catastrophic loss. It required a collection of objects and documents that told the family's story in a coherent and durable form. Not everything, but the essential things, the ones whose loss would change the character of what remained. Everything else was in principle available. The question was always whether the price offered was sufficient. Sometimes it was. A painting sold at auction in 1968 funded the replacement of the roof on the east wing, which had been deteriorating since 1951 and which, if left unfixed, would have caused structural damage to the walls it covered that would have cost 3 times as much to repair. The painting was good. The roof was necessary. The exchange was straightforward, once you had cleared the sentiment from the calculation and looked at the numbers. She looked at the numbers. She authorised the sale. She attended the auction herself, which was unusual, because she wanted to see who bought the painting and to have, in the most private part of her mind, some record of where it went. She did not allow this to become visible in her expression. She watched the hammer fall and nodded once and left. The roof was replaced that winter. It has not required attention since. This is the arithmetic of preservation. The thing that was sacrificed made possible the thing that remained, and the thing that remains is still there, still whole, still serving its function as the physical record of what the family has been. The painting is elsewhere in a collection where it is well cared for and occasionally exhibited. No harm was done to it by the transaction. The harm that was avoided by the transaction was the slow decay of the building that held everything else. She made this calculation many times. Each time it was the same calculation in a different set of clothes, different objects, different prices, different urgencies, but the underlying logic was always the same. Keep what is irreplaceable, sell what is not, use the proceeds to protect what remains. It sounds simpler than it is. It sounds like common sense, which it is, but common sense is not common, and the specific application of it to the specific circumstances of a specific fortune requires the kind of patient, detailed, long-view intelligence that is not given to everyone and cannot be taught without decades of practice. She had the decades, she had the practice, she had the intelligence which had been there from the beginning, and which the decades of practice had sharpened to a precision that was, in its quiet way, remarkable. The morning room is still there, the bookshelves are still there, the painting over the fireplace in the east drawing room is still there. She never sold that one. Not when the offers were good and not when they were excellent, because the painting was the room and the room was the house. And the house was, in some way she could not fully articulate but did not need to articulate herself. She kept it. She kept what she kept. The rest is detail. In the drawer of the rosewood desk there are letters that were written and never sent. Not many. She was not a person given to extensive private writing that she did not intend to use. But there are some, in a folder that is labelled in her handwriting with a word that is not her own name, and not the addressee's name, but a single word that functions as a private classification, understood only by the person who made it. The letters were written at particular moments of difficulty mostly, moments when the communication needed to be made because it existed in her and required expression, but when the sending of it would have done more harm than good. The son who needed to be told what she actually thought of his third business venture, which she thought was misconceived in two specific and fundamental ways that she could have articulated precisely and that she chose not to articulate, because the venture was already committed and the articulation would only have been painful without being corrective. The solicitor who, in the mid-1970s, offered advice that she found not merely wrong but insulting in the assumptions it revealed about his understanding of her capacity, advice she did not follow and did not challenge publicly, because challenging it publicly would have damaged a working relationship she needed intact. The letter she wrote on the night her youngest daughter told her she was moving to Australia. That one she keeps at the back of the folder. She has not reread it in 20 years. She knows what it says. It says what was true at that moment, which was not the same as what she would say now, 20 years into the distance of a relationship maintained at the length of letters and phone calls, and the irregular visits that the geography makes necessary. The daughter is happy in Australia. The letter would have complicated that happiness if it had been sent. It was not sent, and the happiness is real, and the relationship is one of the ones she values most among all the relationships that have aged with her through the decades. She writes things and does not send them, and the things she writes become clearer in the not sending shed of the audience that would have shaped them differently, become purely themselves in the private dark of the folder. She has written, in this way, a parallel record of her life, the internal record, the one that corresponds not to the external events but to her understanding of the external events, her reading of the situations that the official record describes from the outside. The external record shows a woman of property and good standing who managed her affairs with skill and maintained her social connections with consistency and raised her children and outlived her husband and continued, in all the ways that matter to the external record, to perform appropriately within the category she inhabited. The internal record in the folder in the drawer shows a woman who had opinions about all of it. Strong, specific, sometimes uncomfortable opinions held privately without requiring external confirmation or audience, processed at the desk in the early morning and the late evening and the particular middle of the night hours when the house is its most silent and the mind is its most honest. She had, for instance, opinions about the trust structure she created in the 1980s that she has never shared with the solicitor who helped her create it. The structure is correct, she is confident of that, but her reasons for certain specific choices within it are reasons that involve assessments of individual family members that would be unkind to articulate and unnecessary to articulate, given that the structure itself makes the articulation redundant. She knows what she thinks about the capacity of each potential heir to manage responsibility. The structure reflects what she thinks. The structure says, in legal language, what the unsent letter would have said in the language of a mother's honest assessment. The structure is more durable than the letter would have been. But there is something in the letter that the structure cannot hold. The texture of the thinking, the specific quality of her mind in the specific moment of deciding, the warmth and the difficulty and the love that was present even in the most precise calculation. The structure is the outcome, the letter is the process. Both are real. Only one survives in a form that anyone else will ever see. The folder will be found eventually. She's not under any illusion about this. Old desks in old houses are examined eventually, and the things in their drawers are discovered, and what happens to them after that depends on the character of the person who finds them. She's thought about this. She has decided, after some consideration, that she does not mind. The letters are honest, and she has been honest all her life, in the ways that matter, in the decisions that affected other people, and the structures she built to protect the people she loved. The honesty in the folder is a different kind, the honesty of a private record, a life's worth of thinking that was for her own use rather than for anyone else's. If it is read, it will be read by people she has loved, or by their descendants, who will find in it a woman more complicated than the surface suggested. That seems, she thinks, about right. She is more complicated than the surface suggests. She has always been more complicated. The surface was not deception. It was selection, the choice to present the aspect of herself that was useful in any given context, and to keep the rest for the early morning and the late evening and the rosewood desk and the folder in the drawer. The selection served the people around her. It gave them what they needed from her without burdening them with what they did not need. It gave the heirs a grandmother who was warm and sometimes firm and always available. It gave the solicitor a client who was precise and organised and did not complicate his work with emotional demands. It gave the house a keeper who arrived every morning at 5:30 and opened the ledger and picked up the pen and did what needed to be done. It gave her a private self that was complete and sufficient and did not require external recognition. That private self is in the folder. She closes the drawer. She puts on the cap on her pen. She picks up her teacup, which is exactly the right temperature. Outside, the yew hedge stands in the dark. The house holds its silence. A fortune, managed across decades, has seasons. Not in the agricultural sense exactly, though the metaphor is closer to accurate than it might first appear. The fortune that began in land, and most old fortunes began in land, or in the commodities that land produced, or in the trade that moved those commodities between the people who grew them and the people who needed them, has a rhythm that is older than money, a rhythm of accumulation and expenditure, of investment and return, of patience through the fallow periods and attentiveness during the harvest. She has lived through enough cycles to have learned to read them. Spring, in the financial sense, is the period of expansion. Interest rates are favourable. The investments that have been waiting out a difficult period are beginning to perform. The tenancies are fully occupied. The household is running at a level that the income can sustain with something left over. In this season, the decisions to be made are the decisions of growth, where to reinvest the surplus, which opportunity assessed carefully is worth pursuing, which element of the portfolio has been underweight for long enough that adding to it makes sense. She is cautious in spring. This is counterintuitive, and it is the most important thing she has learned about the management of money across a long time. The spring of a financial cycle is the season when the confident decisions get made, the season when it feels obvious where things are going, and the only question seems to be how much to put there. She has lived through enough springs to know that this feeling of obviousness is the most dangerous thing in finance. The moment when the direction of travel is clear to everyone is the moment when the prices of everything in that direction already reflect the clarity, and the opportunity has narrowed to almost nothing. She invests in spring with one eye on the autumn that is eventually coming. She asks about every investment, not what it will do in good conditions. Everyone can model good conditions, but what it will do in the conditions that arrive when the expansion has run its course and something changes and the direction reverses. The investments that survive the reversal are the investments she makes. The ones whose performance depends on the current conditions continuing indefinitely, she leaves to people with shorter time horizons and higher tolerances for loss. She has a very long time horizon, she has a very low tolerance for loss. Summer is the season of maintenance, the long period between the major decisions, when the portfolio is positioned and the properties are performing and the trust arrangements are functioning as designed, and the main work is the careful attention to the details that allow everything to continue at the level it has reached. Summer is not exciting. It is the season of the ledger entries, each one small, each one confirming that the thing is still doing what it should be doing, each one adding its modest entry to the record of continuity. She's most comfortable in summer. The work of summer suits her particular qualities: the patience, the attention to detail, the willingness to make the same careful assessments repeatedly without finding the repetition tedious, the understanding that the absence of problems is itself a kind of achievement. Many people find the summer seasons of financial management insufficiently dramatic. They interpret the absence of urgency as an opportunity to create some. She does not create urgency, she tends the continuity. Autumn arrives in various forms. Sometimes it is a shift in the external economy, a contraction, a crisis, a change in interest rates or taxation policy, or the regulatory environment. Sometimes it is domestic autumn, a death, an inheritance, a family situation that requires reconfiguration of the arrangements. Sometimes it is the quiet autumn of aging itself, the recognition that the time for making certain kinds of decisions is shorter than it once was, and that the structures intended to operate after her death need to be examined and completed with a new kind of attention. She does not resist the autumn, she prepares for it. This is the quality that most distinguishes her from the people who do not preserve what they set out to preserve. They resist the changes, treating each autumn as an aberration rather than a season, adjusting reluctantly and too late and never quite fully, always angled back toward the summer that preceded it, rather than forward toward the spring that will follow if the autumn is navigated correctly. She turns into each season with a full attention on the season that is present, not the one she prefers. Winter is the hardest season. Winter is the season of real difficulty, the period when the external conditions are unfavourable and the internal resources are under genuine pressure, and the decisions being made are not decisions about growth or maintenance, but decisions about survival. She has lived through financial winters and through the personal winters of loss and illness, and the long, cold years when everything that had seemed stable was revealed as contingent, and the work of keeping the thing intact required more of her than she had previously been asked to give. She survived every winter, not without cost. The coats are still there, hanging in the hall from the winter she survived, and each one has a weight that belongs to the season in which it was most worn. But she is here, at the desk, in the early morning, with the ledger and the pen and the teacup at the right temperature. The winter always ends. The spring that follows it is always in some way better understood than the spring before, because the winter has clarified what matters, has stripped away the accretions of expansion and reduced the thing to its essential elements. And the essential elements, examined clearly in the aftermath of difficulty, are always simpler and more durable than they appeared before the difficulty arrived. She knows now what she's keeping. She has known it for years. The winter taught her. Outside the window, the garden is still and dark. The yew hedge, the rose beds, the stone path to the enclosed garden where the oldest roses grow. All of it still there in the dark, growing quietly in whatever season this is. She watches it for a moment before turning back to the desk. The silver in the pantry was last counted in 1989. Not for any particular reason. 1989 was simply the year when the audit happened to be due, when the insurance policy required a current valuation, when the woman who'd been keeping track of it reached a point in her yearly routine when the silver pantry seemed like the appropriate next task, and she opened the door and began. She counted everything herself. She always counted it herself. Not because the housekeeper was unreliable. The housekeeper was perfectly reliable, had been with the house for 16 years at that point, and knew the inventory well enough to notice a missing dessert fork. But because the counting was itself a form of knowledge, a physical and temporal acquaintance with the specific objects that constituted a significant portion of the household's material record. The silver is Georgian and Victorian, accumulated across 5 generations in the specific combination of intentional purchase and inherited bequest that characterizes most old silver collections. Some pieces are marked with the family's monogram in the early form, the interlinked letters used before the current form was adopted at some point in the 1870s, the exact date being unclear because nobody thought to record it, which is itself a small example of the kind of casual unrecordedness that makes the history of old money families so difficult to reconstruct completely. Some pieces were purchased. The large serving dishes came from an auction in 1923 bought by her mother-in-law at a price that the auction catalogue records, and that constitutes one of the few documents in which her mother-in-law appears as an agent rather than simply as a presence. The set of serving spoons came with the estate, their history before that belonging to the estate rather than to the family, a distinction that matters in the paperwork but not in the pantry, where they sit beside the spoons that were undeniably the family's from the beginning. She knows each piece, not always by provenance. The provenance is only partially recoverable, but by object, by the specific weight of it in the hand, the particular quality of the silver's surface, the way it catches light in the pantry's interior light, and in the dining room's candlelight, and in the afternoon light that comes through the pantry window in the hour before the door is closed for the day. Objects accumulate knowledge about the people who use them. This is not mystical. It is simply the record of contact, the ways in which things are marked and worn and adapted to use over time, the scratch on the back of the largest serving dish that has been there since 1952 and that she knows the origin of because she was in the room when the cook's daughter dropped it, and the scratch itself has become part of the dish's history, a small addition to the record it carries of the years it has been in use. She has been counting silver for 50 years in this house. Each counting is an inventory not just of what is present but of what is changed, or what has remained the same, a comparison of the current state with all the previous states held in memory. The candlesticks are the same. They have been the same since before she came to the house. She first saw them in 1956, at a dinner that was her first formal dinner in her future husband's family home, a dinner at which she was on trial in a way that everyone understood but no one acknowledged, at which she performed appropriately and received the approval she had expected to receive, having prepared for the dinner with more care than anyone present, except perhaps her future mother-in-law suspected. The future mother-in-law had been a woman of considerable quality herself. This is something the grandmother has come to understand only in retrospect. Only after the decades of her own management have given her the perspective to see clearly what the older woman was doing in the years when the grandmother was new to the house and learning its systems. She had thought then that her mother-in-law was simply the incumbent, the person whose position she would eventually occupy, whose approval she was working to obtain. She understands now that what she was observing was the work itself, not the personality of the woman, but the practice of the management, the specific decisions and habits and structures that had been keeping the thing intact for the previous generation. She learned from watching, the way she had always learned, by paying attention to what was actually happening rather than what she was being told was happening, by holding the observed reality against the described reality and noting the places where they diverged. Her mother-in-law died in 1971. The handover of the management was not explicit. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no document that said, the responsibility now passes from this woman to that one. It passed through the quality of the work itself, through the quiet accumulation of decisions that began being hers rather than the older woman's, through the gradual shift in who the solicitor addressed, and who the estate manager consulted, and who received the bank's quarterly reports. She took over, and the thing continued, and the difference in management was in the details, in the specific decisions she made differently from the ones her mother-in-law had made, the adjustments she made to the portfolio in the late 1970s that the older woman would probably not have made, the way she approached the estate management in the 1980s that reflected her own understanding of the land's condition, rather than the inherited understanding she had been working within. The silver is still the same silver. The scratch on the back of the largest serving dish is still there. The candlesticks still stand in the pantry between polishings, waiting for the occasions that will bring them out. She closes the pantry door and moves back through the house toward the morning room. The house is quiet around her, the way it is quiet at this hour, the particular late evening quiet that has a texture of its own, a warmth that is partly physical and partly the warmth of long familiarity, the specific sensory richness of a house you have known for 60 years, which presents itself to you not as a collection of rooms and objects, but as a continuous and inhabited atmosphere. She is part of the atmosphere now. She has been for a long time. Every old fortune, examined carefully across its full history, reveals 3 women. This is not a rule in the way that a law of physics is a rule. There are exceptions, and the pattern is not perfectly symmetrical in every case. But it is consistent enough to be worth noting, consistent enough to have the quality of a principle, if not quite of a law. The first woman is the builder's wife. She appears at the point when the fortune is being made, when the man who will eventually be described as the founder of the family's position is engaged in the accumulation that will produce the thing his descendants will inherit. She is present at the founding, usually as a practical partner whose contribution to the enterprise is real but unrecorded, who manages the domestic end of an operation that has no domestic and commercial separation yet, whose judgment is consulted in private even when it is not visible in public, whose steadiness during the difficult years when the accumulation is still uncertain provides the foundation on which the eventual success is built. The builder's wife is rarely remembered. The builder is remembered. The wife's contribution has usually been absorbed into the general narrative of his achievement by the time anyone thinks to ask about it, and the people who might have corrected the narrative are gone before the correcting becomes culturally necessary. She laid the ground. She is not in the official history. The second woman is the manager of the middle generation. She appears when the fortune has been made and passed through one generation, and is now in the hands of people who received it rather than built it, who understand it primarily through its effects rather than its origins. This woman, often, but not always, a widow, is the one who does the detailed preservation work, the work of the decades. She is the one at the desk with the ledger in the early morning. She is the one who understands the trust documents and watches the heirs, and makes the decisions that protect the fortune from the combination of entropy and ambition that threatens it most in the middle generations. She may be remembered within the family. She is almost never recorded outside it. The third woman is the one who inherits the quality without inheriting the fortune, or who inherits a fortune reduced from what it was before the family's structure became inadequate to contain it, and who converts the quality into something else. She is the granddaughter who comes on Tuesday afternoons and asks the right questions and takes notes in the archive of her attention. She is the one in whom the management passes to a new form, a new context, a new set of circumstances that require the old qualities in new applications. She will not manage a landed estate, probably. The landed estates are mostly in different hands now, administered by trusts or open to the public, or converted to purposes their original builders could not have imagined. She will manage something else, a career, a portfolio, a set of relationships with institutions and people that require the same qualities of patience and attention and the refusal to be moved from a considered position that her grandmother applied to the estate. The quality is older than any specific application of it. It has survived the transition from land to finance to whatever the next form will be, because it is not a technique but a disposition, a way of being in relation to the thing you are responsible for that is characterized by attention, patience, and the particular kind of love that expresses itself not through sentiment, but through the sustained willingness to do the work. The three women, the founder's silent partner, the manager of the middle generation, the inheritor of the quality. They are present in every fortune that has lasted long enough to be called old, and they are present whether or not anyone has thought to look for them, whether or not the official record acknowledges them, whether or not the names on the buildings give any indication that the buildings exist because of them. The buildings stand because of them. There is something in that fact that does not require elaboration. It is the kind of fact that holds more in the quiet holding of it than in any examination it might be subjected to. The buildings stand, the fortunes continue, the morning rooms are as they were, the bookshelves hold their books in their specific order. And somewhere, in a house whose address is not in any history, a woman sits at a desk in the early morning, before the rest of the household is awake, with a teacup at the right temperature and a ledger open to the current page. She picks up the pen. She begins. The evenings were hers in a way that the days were not. The days were organised by other people's requirements. The solicitor who needed a decision before 4, the estate manager who arrived at 10 with a list of things requiring her attention, the grandchildren who came and went on their various schedules with their various questions and their various needs. The days were the surface of the management, the visible portion that was organised by the external demands of keeping the thing running. The evenings folded inward. The light changed and the household settled into its quieter register, the kitchen sounds subsiding, the last of the outdoor staff gone home for the night, the house contracting around its own warmth. And she settled too, into a different quality of attention, one that was still precise but less externally directed, turned toward the interior of the thing rather than its surface. She read in the evenings. Not always. On some evenings there were people, family dinners, the occasional formal entertainment, the visits of friends who had survived into old age alongside her, which were among the evenings she valued most. Those visits, the particular pleasure of the company of someone who had known you for 50 years, and whose presence required no management, no performance, no selection of the surface appropriate to the occasion. The friends who had known her for 50 years knew the surface, and knew what was behind it, and were comfortable with both. Those evenings did not require anything from her except being there, which was, in its way, the most restoring kind of company. But most evenings she read. The books she chose in the evenings were different from the books she consulted in the mornings. The mornings were for the reference shelf, the estate management texts, the legal references, the financial history that informed her understanding of where the current situation stood in the longer pattern. The evenings were for the rest of the shelf, the novels, the history, the occasional poetry, the biography that was not professionally relevant but personally interesting, the book of natural history that she had read 3 times and would read again because it described the world with an exactness and a generosity that she found continually satisfying. The reading was not escape. She did not need escape. The life she was living was the life she had chosen, and continued to choose every day by the decisions she made, and the structures she maintained, and the morning when she rose at 5:30, and the evening when she sat down with a book in the lamplight of the morning room. Escape implies a life that needs leaving. Her life did not need leaving. It needed inhabiting, which is a different relationship to one's circumstances, not endurance or flight, but occupation, the full presence in the specific texture of the specific life that is yours, with its particular rooms and particular light and particular archive of decisions visible in everything around you. She inhabited it completely. The lamp in the morning room makes a pool of warm light on the page, and a pool of warm light on the table beside her, and a warm light on the ceiling above the lamp, and the rest of the room is in a comfortable dimness that is not darkness but is the room's evening register, its settled quality. The fire, if the season requires it, makes its own small sounds. The house around her is quiet. She reads for an hour, sometimes longer. The book she's reading now is a history of a particular English county in the 18th century, a careful, local history, specific about the details of land ownership and agricultural practice, and the slow shifts in the patterns of rural life that preceded the larger disruptions of the industrial century. It is not exciting in any conventional sense. It is deeply satisfying to someone who understands the material, who can read the patterns of land use against the patterns of weather and policy and market price, and see how the individual decisions of individual people in individual parishes were part of a larger story that none of them could see from where they were standing. She can see it from where she's standing. The distance of 2 centuries and the overview of someone who has spent a lifetime thinking about these patterns gives her a perspective on the history that the people in it could not have had. She finds this perspective both clarifying and humbling. Clarifying because the patterns visible from a distance are genuinely illuminating about how things work. Humbling because she is aware that she herself is inside a pattern she cannot fully see, that her own decisions, which feel to her considered and deliberate, are also the decisions of someone who cannot observe herself from a sufficient distance to know which of them will be the ones that matter. She manages this uncertainty the way she manages all uncertainty, by doing the best analysis available to her with the information she has, making the decision that analysis supports, and then accepting that the outcome is not entirely within her control, and moving on to the next decision. This is, she has found, sufficient. It is not satisfying in the way that certainty would be satisfying, but certainty is not available, and sufficiency, consistently applied, produces outcomes that are generally good and occasionally excellent, which is the best any honest person can claim for any method of decision-making. The fire burns lower. The book goes on in its careful, specific way through the fields and parishes of a long-gone county. The lamp makes its warm pool on the page. She reads. The evening holds its warmth. She has worked with 4 solicitors across her adult life. The first was the family solicitor when she married, a man whose practice had served the family since her husband's grandfather's time, and whose relationship to the estate was so thoroughly the relationship of long-established familiarity that he had, by the time she began working with him, lost the ability to see it clearly. He saw the estate as it had always been, which is not the same as seeing it as it was. The distinction matters enormously, and she understood this from the beginning of their working relationship, which was why she asked questions that seemed, from his perspective, unnecessarily basic, questions about the current state of arrangements he considered settled, and why she occasionally found, in the gap between his explanation and the document he was explaining, the discrepancies that needed correcting. He was not dishonest. He was comfortable. Comfort produces its own kind of blindness, and she spent the first decade of their working relationship seeing around the edges of his comfort, filling in what it obscured with the independent information she gathered from sources he did not know she had. When he retired, she hired the second solicitor herself, which was unusual enough that it required the sort of indirect management that she had become skilled at. The series of conversations that left everyone involved feeling that the appointment had been made by consensus when it had in fact been made by her, the consensus being the form in which she addressed her decision for the benefit of the men whose cooperation she needed for its execution. The second solicitor was sharper, younger, and initially inclined to explain things to her at a level of simplification that suggested he had not yet understood who she was. This was corrected over the course of 3 or 4 meetings through the same mechanism of precise questions that had shaped her working relationship with his predecessor. By the 5th meeting, he addressed her at the level of complexity appropriate to their respective understandings, which required him to rise somewhat and allowed her to stop translating downward. That was more useful for everyone. The third solicitor was a woman, which was the first time that had been true, and which made the working relationship different in ways that were partly practical and partly atmospheric. The practical differences involved the assumptions the solicitor brought to the conversation. She did not assume that her client needed things explained. She did not modulate her language to accommodate a presumed gap in understanding. She brought the full technical complexity of the advice to the first meeting, and waited to see how it was received before deciding how to pitch subsequent ones. She received it well. The subsequent meetings were the most productive working relationship she had had with a legal advisor in 50 years. The atmospheric differences were harder to articulate but present. There was a quality in the room, a quality of 2 people who both understood something that they had each, separately, spent decades navigating, and whose understanding of it did not need to be explained to the other person. The solicitor had her own experience of being the person in the room whose knowledge exceeded what the other people in the room expected. They did not discuss this. They simply worked with a directness and a mutual respect that the conversations with the male solicitors had approached but never quite reached. The 4th solicitor is the current one, a man in his late 40s who is capable and organised, and who defers to her in the way that capable, organised men of his generation occasionally defer to old women of a certain evident authority, with a genuine respect that has been educated into him by experience, not the shallow deference of someone who doesn't believe the deference is warranted, but performs it anyway for courtesy, but the deeper kind that comes from having observed, over time, what she has built and how it is held. He is the one she is training, in the indirect way she trains people, to manage the transition. The transition, her own eventual departure from the management in whatever form that takes, has been on her planning horizon for 20 years. She does not find it a morbid subject. It is a practical subject, the most important practical subject in the current phase of the management, because the arrangements she makes now for what happens after her will be the last set of arrangements she makes, and they need to be the best. She has been making them. The trust structure has been updated. The investment management arrangements are in place. The instructions to the estate manager are documented. The conversations with the granddaughter, the most important of the human arrangements, are proceeding in the way they should. The solicitor knows most of this, not all of it. There are elements of the arrangement that are documented in ways he has not seen, in forms that will become relevant at the appropriate time and not before. This is not distrust. She trusts him, within the bounds that trust can be extended to someone whose incentives are not fully aligned with hers. It is precision. The information he needs to do his work is the information he has. The information he does not need, she has placed where it will be available when it is needed. She has thought about all of it. She has been thinking about all of it for a very long time. The current solicitor is doing good work. She will tell him so at their next meeting, which is in 3 weeks, before which she will have reread the latest draft of the amended trust schedule and identified the 2 small adjustments she wants to make, and arrived at the meeting with the changes clearly articulated and the reasons for them clearly in mind. The meeting will take 90 minutes, the adjustments will be incorporated, the trust will be slightly better than it was before. That is how it is done, not in large gestures but in the accumulation of small corrections, each one right, each one adding its small measure to the thing that is being built to last. She planted the yew hedge in May of 1961. It was not a difficult decision as decisions go. The east boundary of the garden needed definition. The previous planting had been removed to allow for a drainage project in 1958 and had never been replaced, and the open boundary had been bothering her in the specific way that unresolved things bother a person who finds incompleteness an aesthetic problem as well as a practical one. She chose yew for the reasons that yew is always chosen for this kind of work. It is dense, it is responsive to shaping, it is extraordinarily long-lived, and it grows at exactly the right rate. Fast enough that you will see the result in your lifetime, slow enough that the result will not need to be undone in your lifetime. It was, in all its qualities, a plant designed for the long view, and she was a woman who took the long view, and the fit between the nature of the material and the nature of the person planting it was complete. She drove the stakes herself that May morning. The plants that went in were small, 18 inches tall, modest things, their potential invisible to anyone who was not already imagining what they would become. The gardener, who had been with the house for 4 years and was still learning the way she thought about the garden, asked whether she wanted something more immediate, something that would provide the boundary effect while the yew was growing. She said no, she wanted the yew. She wanted it because temporary solutions to permanent problems are not solutions. They are deferments, and deferments create their own complications. The visual awkwardness of the temporary planting that outstays its welcome, the expense of removing it when the permanent solution has grown enough to make the temporary one redundant. She did not want a temporary solution. She wanted the yew, and she planted the yew, and the yew grew. It is 14 feet tall now, dense, dark green, formal in the way that yew formality is formal, not rigid but exact, the kind of precision that is alive and therefore slightly different every year, the hedge growing imperceptibly at the top and the sides and being cut back each August to maintain the form, the annual cutting being itself a kind of conversation between the gardener and the plant about the form the gardener intends and the growth the plant will produce between now and the following August. She does not cut the hedge herself anymore. She did for the first 15 years because the gardener changed and she preferred to establish the form herself rather than try to explain it to someone new. The form she established in those 15 years is the form that subsequent gardeners have maintained. It is her form, her decision about what the hedge should be, its height relative to the wall beside it, its slight outward curve at the base, the narrow clearance between the top of the hedge and the lower branches of the tree beyond it. The garden is full of these decisions. Every form in it was at some point a decision, a specific judgment about what should be there and in what relationship to what else should be there, judgments made across 60 years and layered on top of each other in ways that are now difficult to disentangle but that constitute together the garden's character. She knows all the layers. She can read the garden in the way she reads the house, finding in each element the decision that produced it and the moment of the decision and sometimes the state of mind in which the decision was made. The rose beds along the south wall were planted in the spring of her husband's death, which was a planting of the kind she does not usually allow herself, sentiment visible in the choice, the roses having been his favourites, their presence in the garden a form of the memorial that she could not bring herself to make in any more public way. They are beautiful roses. She does not regret the sentiment. The enclosed garden at the end of the stone path was made in the late 1970s, during a period when the garden needed a project, something that would generate the kind of sustained physical engagement that she found, in those years, necessary for the management of anxiety. The enclosed garden gave her a project of sufficient complexity and sufficient duration, 3 years from the initial design to the completion of the planting, to anchor the anxious portion of her attention while the rest of her attention dealt with the financial and legal concerns that were generating the anxiety. She finds, and has always found, that physical work is the best management tool for mental states that resist purely mental address. The anxiety does not think its way out. It works its way out, in the garden or in the house, in the specific physical engagement with a specific task that has dimensions beyond the mental, and that occupies enough of the mind's available processing capacity to leave insufficient room for the cycling of the anxious thought. The garden has absorbed a great deal of anxiety over 60 years. It is in this sense a record of her interior life as well as a record of her aesthetic decisions, and her horticultural knowledge, and her understanding of the relationship between plants and soil and light, and the specific microclimate of this particular patch of land in this particular county. The garden will continue after her. She has arranged for this, through the provision she has made in the estate documents, through the conversations she has had with the granddaughter who has expressed genuine interest in and affinity for the garden, through the relationship she has cultivated with the current gardener who is young enough and skilled enough to be the garden's steward for the next generation. The yew hedge will still be there. It will be 18 feet tall, perhaps, by the time the granddaughter is old, and it will have the form it has because she drove the stakes in May of 1961 and said no to the temporary solution and waited for the permanent one to grow. That decision is in the hedge is in the garden is in the world. Things accumulate, they persist, they outlast the decisions that made them, carrying those decisions forward in a form that future hands will tend without knowing whose hands shaped them first. There is a weight to an old name that has nothing to do with reputation and everything to do with expectation. This is a distinction that takes some time to arrive at and that is easy to confuse with its neighbour. Reputation is about the past, what was done, what was achieved, what the record shows. Expectation is about the present and the future. What is required now, what the name commits the person carrying it to, what the people who encounter the name will bring to the encounter, in the form of assumptions and demands that have nothing to do with the individual and everything to do with the category. She has carried an old name for 60 years. She understands the weight. The weight expresses itself in small ways and large. In the small ways, the banker who addresses her with a particular formality that is calibrated not to her but to the name, who manages the account with attentiveness that is partly professional and partly the attentiveness of someone who understands that this account represents a relationship that his institution has maintained for 4 generations, and that maintaining it well is itself a form of service to the institution's history. In the banker's formality there is respect for something larger than the individual, which is both pleasant in its way and slightly impersonal, as though the person he is really serving is not her but the name. In the large ways, the decisions she cannot make because the name prevents them, the options that are not available because the expectations attached to the name make them incompatible with carrying it. She could not in any practical sense have sold the house when the selling of it would have made financial sense by any calculation that did not include the weight of the name. She could not have dissolved the trust when there were moments, and there were moments, when the trust constraints felt like a burden rather than a protection. She could not have withdrawn from the obligations of management into the simpler life that some part of her, in certain exhausted periods, has briefly wanted. The name prevents certain exits. This is what people do not understand who have not carried one. That old names are not merely advantages, not merely doors that open at the touch of the right letters. They are also walls, defining the space within which the person carrying them is able to move, and the walls are not chosen, they are inherited along with everything else. She has on the whole found the walls acceptable. They define a space that is large enough for a full life, and the things they exclude are things she has mostly not regretted the exclusion of. But she is honest enough to acknowledge that the life she has lived was not entirely chosen. It was partly shaped by the weight of what she carried, by the expectations that came with the name and that she has spent 60 years meeting. Meeting them was a choice made repeatedly every morning at the desk and every afternoon in the conversations with the solicitor and every evening in the garden. But it was a choice made within a constrained set of alternatives, which is still a choice but is not the same as a choice made in the open. The granddaughter will inherit the name, she will also inherit the weight. She is, by the evidence available, adequately equipped for the weight. She has the quality of attention, she has the patience, she has the willingness to do the work. She has shown this in the Tuesday conversations, in the questions she asks, in the notes she takes in the archive of her attention. She does not yet fully understand what she is taking on. Nobody does, at her age. The understanding comes with the carrying, not before it. You cannot know the weight of a name until you are the one who holds it up, until the banker's formality is directed at you, and the solicitor's deference is calibrated to your name, and the house is yours to maintain, and the trust is yours to protect, and the morning room is yours to sit in with the ledger open on the desk. She will find out, she will be adequate to it. Of this the grandmother is as confident as she is confident of anything, which is to say, confident based on the available evidence, open to being wrong, prepared for any necessary revision of the assessment. This is how she holds everything, firmly enough to act on, loosely enough to revise. The name will continue. The thing the name names will continue. The house will still be there, and the yew hedge will still be growing, and the morning room will hold its particular quality of early light, and the bookshelves will hold their books in their specific order. Not forever. Nothing is forever. But for the next generation, and probably the generation after that, because the structures are sound and the person who is coming is adequate to them, the thing will continue. That is what she was working toward. That is what the early mornings and the ledger and the teacup at the right temperature were for. The house at night is different from the house in the day. This is not a metaphysical statement. It is a sensory one. The sounds are different. Not louder, but more individual, each sound standing out against the silence the way a single note stands out in a quiet room, distinct and complete in itself. The house settles at night in a way it does not settle during the day, making small sounds of thermal contraction as the temperature drops, sounds that someone who did not know the house might find unsettling, and that she finds, after 60 years, simply the house being itself in its nighttime register. She wakes sometimes in these hours. Not from anxiety, not in recent years. The wakefulness of her 70s and 80s was sometimes attended by anxiety, the particular 3 a.m. quality of mind that transforms manageable concerns into sources of genuine distress, that reviews the decisions of the day and finds them wanting, that reaches forward into the possible difficulties of the coming week and imagines them at their worst. She had methods for managing that wakefulness, methods she developed over years of practice, methods that involved neither trying to return to sleep nor giving full attention to the anxious thought, but something between the two, a quiet, unfocused attention to the present moment of being awake, the sounds of the house, the weight of the covers, the specific darkness of the room in winter versus summer, the presence of the house around her as a physical fact rather than an abstract worry. The wakefulness now, in her 80s, is different. It is simply wakefulness, without the attendant anxiety, the mind at rest but not quite asleep, present in the body and the room and the night without any particular requirement of either sleep or activity. She lies in the specific warmth of her own bed and is awake in it without being troubled by the wakefulness, receiving the nighttime sounds of the house with the mild interest of someone who's been listening to those sounds for 60 years and finds them still specific and familiar and her own. The house sound she most likes, and has always most liked, is the sound of rain on the roof of the East Wing. The East Wing was built in 1887, and its roof has a particular pitch and a particular material, Welsh slate, replaced twice but to the original specification, that produces a specific quality of sound when rain falls on it, a sound that is distributed and multiple, 1,000 small individual sounds becoming a continuous texture that is soft and even, and deeply, specifically characteristic of that roof and that rain. She has slept under that sound, when it comes, since she first came to this house. It is as familiar to her as her own name. More familiar, in the way that sensory things are more intimate than words, reaching directly into the register of recognition that exists below the conscious level and communicating their familiarity there, in the body's archive of known things, rather than in the mind's library of understood ones. The rain is not always present when she wakes at night. Often the sky is clear and the sounds are the interior sounds of the house, the thermal contractions, the distant settling of old wood. But when the rain comes, when she hears the first drops on the glass and the sound builds toward the full texture on the slate, she feels something that is hard to describe accurately and that she has never tried to describe to anyone else. A quality of rightness, of being exactly where she has always been, of the external world confirming through sound what she already knows through every other means, that this house is hers and she is in it, and everything she has worked to protect is present around her in the dark. She closes her eyes. The rain continues. It is patient and even and without urgency, the way it always is, simply water falling in the dark, landing on the slate that has been here for 100 years, making the sound that has been making itself since the slate was first put down by men whose names she will never know, whose work she has been sleeping under for 60 years. The house holds her. She has held the house. There is no difference, really, between these two facts. They are the same facts stated from different positions, the mutual holding of a person and a place across the years, each sustaining the other in the way that long inhabitation produces, the house becoming part of her experience of herself, she becoming part of the house's record of itself. Sleep begins at the edges. The sounds grow softer, not because they are quieter, but because the attention that receives them is softening, relaxing its edges, allowing things in at the level of sensation rather than comprehension. The rain is still there. The house is still there. The ledger is on the desk in the morning room, closed, the pen beside it. Tomorrow she'll open it, she'll pick up the pen, she'll make the entry for the day and plan the work for the coming week, and the decisions that need making and the conversations that need having. But not now. Now she's simply in the house, in the dark, in the warm weight of the bed, with the rain on the slate above her, and the years of her life present in every room around her, quiet and complete. The house breathes. She breathes. A trust document, read slowly enough, is a portrait. Not a portrait of the person whose name appears in it as the beneficiary, though the trust is designed with that person specifically in mind. It is a portrait of the person who made it, of their beliefs about human nature and time and money, and what people tend to do with things that are given to them without conditions. It captures a mind in the act of reasoning about the future, and the future, by definition, cannot be known, and so the portrait is also a portrait of how the maker of the trust inhabits uncertainty, what they account for, what they protect against, what they choose to allow. She has read a great many trust documents in her life. She has made several. The ones she has made are better than the ones she inherited, which is not a criticism of the people who made the inherited ones. They were made with the knowledge and the legal frameworks of their times, and they performed their functions adequately for their generations. But the world changes, and the law changes, and the family's specific vulnerabilities and strengths change, and the best trust document is not the one that was state-of-the-art in 1922, but the one that is appropriate to the specific family and the specific current circumstances, with the specific future that can currently be reasonably anticipated. She has updated the trust several times. Each update reflects something she has learned, something the previous version did not account for sufficiently, some development in the family situation or in the external environment that required adjustment. The most significant update was made in the early 1990s, when a combination of tax law changes and personal circumstances, her second son's death, the changed landscape of the family's likely future, made a fundamental restructuring appropriate. That restructuring took 2 years to complete, working with the third solicitor, the woman, whose contribution to the process was both technically excellent and personally engaged in a way that the work required. What the restructuring achieved, in practical terms, was a set of arrangements that protected the core assets more robustly than the previous arrangements had, that provided appropriate flexibility for the individuals who would benefit from the trust, while preventing the kind of structural harm that over-flexibility produces, and that positioned the trust to survive not just the current generation of heirs, but the generation after that. 2 generations is the planning horizon she has used consistently. It is ambitious without being absurd. She can reasonably anticipate the characteristics and circumstances of the people who will be her grandchildren's age 20 years from now, because those people are already alive and she knows them and has been watching them for years. She cannot reasonably anticipate what the world will look like when they have grandchildren of their own, and attempting to plan for that level of specificity would produce documents so rigid that their rigidity would become its own kind of danger. 2 generations, specific enough to be useful, general enough to allow for the reality that the future is not a continuation of the present. The trust document she has now is the best one she's made. She thinks this every time she rereads it, which she does once a year, in the autumn, before the annual meeting with the solicitor. Each reading confirms that it continues to be appropriate, or identifies the small adjustment that would make it more appropriate, or surfaces the question that requires further thought, The current reading, the one she did last October, identified one small adjustment and one question requiring further thought. The adjustment has been made, the question is still being thought about. She's thinking about it now. In the early morning at the desk, the ledger open to the current page, the pen in her hand and the question in the part of her mind that runs continuously below the level of the immediate, working on problems while she attends to other things, presenting its findings in the form of a sudden clarity that arrives, usually in the first hour after waking. The question concerns a specific clause relating to the distribution of income in a particular circumstance that is currently hypothetical, but might not always be hypothetical, and the current language of the clause is adequate but not quite as precise as it should be, and the revision she's considering would make it more precise but might introduce a complexity that creates its own problems. She has been holding this question for 3 months. She will hold it a little longer. The answer will arrive when it is ready. She trusts this, based on the evidence of 60 years of making decisions, which is that the decisions that required extended deliberation were, in the majority of cases, better for having been deliberated, that the answer that arrived after 3 months of quiet background processing was more complete, more robust, more aware of its own limitations than the answer that would have arrived at the end of the first week. She waits for the right answer. She does not confuse waiting with inaction. The morning light is fully established now. The early grey resolved into the specific quality of light that belongs to this room on this day. A slightly overcast autumn morning, the light diffuse and even, flattering to the books on the shelves and the surface of the desk and the pale walls that were last painted in a colour she chose in 1994 and that she would choose again. She makes the entry in the ledger, small, precise, in the hand that has not changed substantially in 50 years. The trust is as it should be. The question is still being thought about. The morning continues. December in an old house has a quality all its own. The year is completing itself. The light comes late and goes early, and in the hours of the day when there is light it has a particular winter quality, low-angled, clear, carrying no warmth but producing, in the right rooms, a startling brightness that is almost more illuminating than summer light, because it is horizontal rather than vertical, coming in through the windows at the level of the desk and the table, and the faces of the people sitting at them. December is the month of the long tables. The family gathers. Not all of it. The family is large enough now that a complete gathering would require more room than any of the houses could easily provide, and the branches of it are sufficiently distributed that a complete gathering would require travel from distances that make the casual annual assembly impractical. But the main branch gathers, and the gathering includes 3 generations, sometimes 4, and the long tables are set in the dining room, and the drawing room, and the larger rooms that are kept for exactly this kind of occasion. She has been at the head of these tables for 40 years. Not always at the literal head, in the sense of the specific chair. The specific chair is more or less where the family's most senior woman sits by convention, and she has occupied it for 40 years with the combination of genuine pleasure and quiet authority that the position requires. But the headship she exercises is not primarily physical. It is the headship of the person whose understanding of the gathering is the most complete, who knows the history of every relationship at the table, who has watched every person present through their decades, who holds in mind simultaneously the person at the table and the child they were and the adult they might still become. She sees all of them at once in this way, the son who is 70 and still to some portion of her attention, the boy who ran across the hall in 1965 in the small hours of a December morning because he thought he heard something, the granddaughter who is 30 and still, to some portion of her attention, the 7-year-old who sat beside her on a Tuesday afternoon and asked what the portrait in the East drawing room was of, and received an answer that was both precise and warm, and that the 7-year-old received with a seriousness that the grandmother had noted and remembered. The table is long. The candles are the Georgian candlesticks from the silver pantry, brought out for December in the way they have been brought out for December since they came to the house, in 1923. The flowers are from the garden, such as December allows, the last of the winter roses from the enclosed garden, supplemented with greenery from the yew hedge, cut in November and lasting into the new year in the cool of the house. She made the arrangement herself. She always makes the arrangement herself. The conversation at the table moves through its various registers, general and particular, light and serious, the universal currency of family conversation, which is the narrating of recent events to people who were not present for them, the comparison of experiences, the in-jokes that have survived 20 years and that are still deployed with the reliable pleasure of familiar things. She listens to all of it. She contributes to the parts of it that she wants to contribute to. She lets pass the parts that do not require her contribution, which is more of it than people expect, because her presence at the table is a presence that has weight independent of her participation in specific conversations, and the weight is more usefully deployed in listening than in speaking. She has learned this over 40 years of headship. The most effective presence is not the most voluble one, it is the most attentive one. The candles make their warm light on the tablecloth and on the faces of the people she has spent her life loving, and the glasses and the silver and the flowers from the garden. The December light from the windows is gone now. It went at 4 as it does in December, and the room is lit only by the candles and the fire and the lamps at the room's edges, and the specific quality of that light, the warmth of it in the December dark, is something she has been present in every year of her adult life. It is one of the things she loves most about the house. Not the house as property, not the house as asset or responsibility or trust arrangement or architectural record of the family's past. The house as the place where the candles make that particular light on the particular faces of the particular people who are hers in the December dark at the long tables. That is what she protected. Not the fortune exactly, the fortune made the table possible, but the table was the point. She looks down the length of it. Everyone she loves best is somewhere along it, in whatever form they take at this age and this moment. Some of them older now than she expected them to be. Some of them changed from what she imagined they would become, all of them real in the way that only long and intimate knowledge makes people real, known in their full complication rather than their surface, held in love that has the particular quality of love that has survived difficulty and time. The candles burn. The table holds its warmth. The portrait in the East drawing room was painted in 1978. She was 60 that year. She sat for the painter in 3 sessions, each of 2 hours, in the morning room where the light was best, and she wore the dress she had chosen with some care because the dress would be in the painting long after she was gone, and she thought it worth choosing well. The painter was a woman who worked primarily in the traditional manner. Oil, large canvas, the sitter in a chair, the background suggesting the environment without over-determining it. The background in the painting is the East drawing room itself, rendered in the soft suggestion of someone who understands that the background is in service of the subject and should not compete with it for the viewer's attention. The fireplace is there, rendered in broad brush strokes that convey the presence of the stone without providing the detail that would become a distraction. The mantle above it, the edge of the portrait that hangs above the mantle, her mother-in-law's portrait, painted in 1939 and visible in the new painting as a rectangle of darker background, one portrait inside another, the continuity of the line made visible. She's in the chair that is always in that room, that has been in that room since before she came to the house, that she has never moved because it was in the right place when she arrived, and it remains in the right place now. Her hands are in her lap, folded in the way hands fold when a person is comfortable in stillness, and not performing stillness for someone else's benefit. Her expression has the quality of attention directed slightly inward, not distracted, not absent, but present in the way of someone who is looking at something the viewer cannot see. The painter caught this. She had not known the painter would catch it, but when she saw the completed work she recognized herself in that expression, recognized it as more accurate than any description she would have produced of herself if asked, recognized in it the thing she had not known was visible from the outside. The portrait has been in that room since 1978. It has watched 47 years of the drawing room's life, the dinners and the casual evenings and the Tuesday afternoon conversations and the December candlelight and the days when the room was used and the days when it was empty. It has watched the granddaughter grow from 7 to 30, from the child who asked about the portrait to the young woman who now looks at it from across a room with an expression that the grandmother recognizes as the beginning of understanding. The portrait sees what portraits see, which is everything continuously, without fatigue or distraction or the need to look away. It is the room's most patient witness, its record of the room's life extending from 1978 forward into whatever future the room will have. She does not look at the portrait often, not because it is uncomfortable to look at, she is comfortable with it, comfortable with what it shows, but because she does not need to look at it to know it is there. Its presence is part of the room's presence, part of the atmosphere of the drawing room that she inhabits as naturally and completely as she inhabits all the atmospheres of this house. But sometimes, in the evenings when the light has gone and the room is lit only by the lamps and the fire, she looks up at it from the chair where she has been sitting and feels the quality of the meeting, not of her eyes and the paint, but of the current self and the recorded self, the woman in the chair and the woman in the painting, both of them here in the same room, one of them changing and one of them fixed, the fixed one now older than the changing one was when the painting was made. It is a strange kind of companionship, she thinks, but a real one. The woman in the painting does not age. She will be 60 for as long as the painting holds. She will have that specific expression, the inward attention, the composed hands, the quality of someone who is looking at something the viewer cannot see, for as long as anyone looks at her. What she was looking at in 1978, in the morning room in the good light that the painter preferred, she cannot reconstruct it precisely. Some problem, probably. Some question she was working through, in the part of her mind that runs below the surface, the part that was always working on something, present and visible in the expression that the painter caught and committed to oil, and that has been on the wall ever since. Whatever the question was, she has an answer for it now. She looks up at the portrait in the lamplight of the evening. The woman in the portrait looks back with that expression of inward attention, that quality of someone engaged with something the viewer cannot access. They hold this for a moment, the old woman in the chair and the 60-year-old in the painting, and then she turns back to her book. The portrait continues watching. The room holds its warmth. In the course of a long life, a great many things are said. She has said things she regrets, not many, but some. The conversation with her elder son in 1987, when the firmness she was applying to a necessary refusal crossed into something that felt in the recollection like harshness, a quality she had not intended and that she recognized too late, after the conversation had ended and the door had closed, and that she addressed the following day in the quiet conversation that corrected the tone without revisiting the substance. The thing she said to her daughter in the spring of 1994, during a period of difficulty between them that had its roots in events a decade earlier, and that broke surface in a way she had not managed as well as she would have wished. The remark she made to the solicitor in 1976 when the frustration of the moment exceeded the bounds of what she would normally permit herself, and that was professionally repaired but personally remained a note in a minor key in the memory of that working relationship. 3 things in 60 years of significant conversation. She does not believe this is exceptional exactly, but she is aware that it reflects a level of management that required consistent effort and was not, in the earlier years, natural. The management she has exercised over her own speech is the same management she has exercised over everything else in her domain. The same patience, the same precision, the same willingness to hold the thing rather than act on it, until the holding has produced the clarity that makes action appropriate. She has, in general, said what she thought. She has done this in the careful way that thoughtful people say what they think, with the awareness that the full thought, delivered unselected, is not always the most useful version of the thought, and that the selection of what to include and what to hold is not dishonesty but courtesy, the respect for the other person's experience of the conversation that honest communication requires. She has also said sometimes things that were harder to say than to withhold. The truth about a business venture that her granddaughter, the one who is not the Tuesday granddaughter, was enthusiastic about and that she could see clearly would not work and said so, with evidence and with warmth and with the understanding that the granddaughter would receive this with difficulty and would probably not immediately agree and would need to arrive at her own understanding in her own time, and that the best outcome of the conversation was not immediate agreement, but the planting of a perspective that would be available to the granddaughter when her own experience gave her the grounds to understand it. She was right about the business venture. The granddaughter arrived at her own understanding 2 years later, without acknowledgement and without needing to acknowledge. She simply moved on, as people do when they have reached a conclusion through their own experience. And the conclusion happened to be the one that the grandmother had reached 2 years earlier and expressed once and then waited for. That is the form of honesty she values, the kind that says the thing once clearly with evidence, and then releases it into the relationship to work at whatever pace the relationship allows. She has said, across 60 years of management, a great many things that needed to be said and were said at the right moment in the right way to the right person. She has also held back, across those 60 years, a great many things that were true and would have been satisfying to say and that would not have served the person she was saying them to. The withholding is as much a part of the record as the saying. It is in the folder in the desk drawer, it is in the unsent letters, it is in the expressions on the faces of the people who received her quiet listening and her precise questions when they might have expected either agreement or confrontation, and received instead the third thing, the attentive waiting, the space in which the conversation was allowed to find its own level. They are still there, the people she said things to. Most of them. The ones who are still alive carry in themselves the things she said, in whatever form those things took inside them, absorbed or disputed or revised over time, present as background in the way that significant conversations become background, contributing their weight to the person without being consciously recalled in every moment. She exists in this way inside the people she has spoken to, inside her children and their children, and the solicitors and the estate managers and the friends who have survived alongside her, and the friends who have not survived, who carry her in whatever form they carry anyone they have loved. This is a form of continuity she did not design. It simply happened through the years of presence and care and careful speech and carefully withheld speech. It is the continuity of influence, which is different from the continuity of the trust, or the house, or the name, and which cannot be put in a document or protected by legal arrangements. It is there or it is not, depending on the quality of what was given. She believes it is there. The evening is quiet, the house holds its familiar warmth, the fire in the morning room has burned down to the embers that she will leave to go cold overnight and restart in the morning. She closes her book. She sets it down with the care of someone who will return to it, marking the page with the folded slip of paper she uses for the purpose, a slip torn from the margin of a newspaper years ago, and never replaced because it has continued to serve. She sits with the closing of the day for a moment, not thinking exactly, simply present in it. Then she rises, and the house moves around her, and she makes her way through the familiar dark of the corridor to the room where she has slept for 60 years. There are 3 rooms in the north wing that have been closed since 1983. Not sealed, she's not a person who seals rooms, who makes memorials of spaces whose original purposes have been superseded. The rooms are simply closed, their functions transferred to other rooms, their maintenance reduced to the minimum that prevents deterioration, their future purpose unresolved in a way that she acknowledges and accepts as an unresolved question, one that the current generation will answer in its own time. The closing of the North Wing rooms in 1983 was a practical decision. The household had reduced in size, the children were adults and gone, the extended family visits had settled into shorter and less frequent patterns, the staffing that would have been required to maintain all 3 rooms at full readiness had become a cost that the income of the estate could not justify. The decision to close them was made in the same way as all the practical decisions, assessed against the alternatives, compared to the specific cost of maintaining them versus the cost of the alternative uses to which those resources might be put, decided in favour of closure. She does not visit the closed rooms often. When she does, she finds them in the state they were left. Dust sheets on the furniture, the curtains drawn to protect the upholstery from light damage, the air still and slightly cool with the particular cool of rooms that are not heated. They are not sad rooms. They are simply rooms waiting, holding their objects in the patient dark, being maintained at the level that preserves them without activating them, present in the house without being in use. She walked through them last spring, as she does occasionally. She opened the curtains in each room and looked at the condition of what was there, the furniture, the paintings, the objects that have been in those rooms since they were furnished in the early 1900s. Everything was as it should be. The dust sheets had done their work, the curtains had done theirs. She stood for a while in the middle room, the one that had been the nursery, which was the room she knew best of the 3 from its active years, the room that holds the most specific associations. The furniture is the furniture that was there when her children were young, not the original nursery furniture which was before her time, but the furniture that was current in the 1960s, the comfortable pieces of a mid-century nursery that have been superseded by changing ideas about how children should be housed without being replaced. The room was very quiet. She stood in it for the length of time that felt appropriate, which was neither very long nor very short, and then she drew the curtains again and went back through the corridor to the inhabited part of the house. The north wing has its answer ready, she thinks. Not an answer she's made, one that will be made by whoever comes after her, whenever the family's needs change in the way that family needs change, whenever the house is inhabited in a different way or by a different number or for different purposes than it is currently. The closed rooms will be opened then, or they will be repurposed, or they will be incorporated into a different arrangement of the house's space. One of those things will happen. What she has done is preserve the condition in which they will be found when that decision is made. She has kept them from deteriorating. She has maintained the objects in them in a state that allows them to be used, or repurposed, or assessed for sale. All the options remain open, because she kept the rooms rather than letting them go, and she kept them in the right condition rather than simply letting them stand. The decision about what to do with them belongs to the future. The condition of them belongs to her. This is the distinction she makes consistently in the work of management. Her responsibility is to preserve the options, not to exercise all of them. The options she keeps open are more valuable than the specific choice of any one of them, because the option has value in all the futures in which the choice might be made, while the specific choice has value only in the specific future in which it was the right choice. She keeps the rooms closed and the options open. The dust sheets lie still on the furniture in the patient dark. The curtains hold the light out and the condition in. The oldest roses in the enclosed garden were planted by her mother-in-law. They are not beautiful roses by the standard of roses that are cultivated for beauty. They are the old kind, wild in their form, extravagant in June, brief, producing small blooms of a colour that is difficult to name exactly because it shifts between the deep pink that it is at the centre and the pale, almost white that it becomes at the edges of the petals, a colour that exists only in itself and in the particular quality of light that this garden produces in the first weeks of June when the sun is at its highest angle and the rose is in its fullest moment. She cut them once in the first year of her marriage, thinking to improve the form. Her mother-in-law observed this with an expression that communicated, without words, that the cutting was not welcome. Nothing was said. The roses were not cut again, and in the following June, when the roses were at their fullest, she stood at the opening of the enclosed garden and looked at them and understood, without any need for the understanding to be articulated, what her mother-in-law had been communicating with that expression. You did not improve these roses by cutting them. They improved themselves by being left to grow. This was one of the most useful things she learned in the early years of the marriage, and she learned it from a garden, not from a conversation. The thing that has found its form, that has been growing toward its own rightness for longer than you have been attending to it, does not need your improvement. It needs your protection, your observation, your patience while it continues to do what it has been doing, which is growing toward its own right form in its own time. The lesson applies broadly. She has applied it broadly. Some heirs needed active management, structure and guidance and the legal arrangements that protected them from their own tendencies. Others needed something closer to the treatment of the old roses, protection from interference, space to grow in their own direction, the patience of someone who understood that the rightness would come but could not be forced. The granddaughter is an old rose kind of heir. She has her own form and her own direction and her own quality of mind, and the most useful thing that can be done for her is to ensure that the conditions are right, the soil, the light, the protection from the specific winds that damage, and then to wait while she grows toward what she already is. This is the work of the Tuesday conversations, not to instruct, to assess, to provide what is needed, which is sometimes information and sometimes simply the quality of being seen clearly by someone whose seeing matters. The rain begins in the late afternoon which the garden needed. October rain, the good slow kind, the kind that penetrates rather than runs off, that reaches the roots rather than cleaning the surfaces and departing. She watches it from the window of the morning room, the grey light and the steady rain on the garden, the wet slate of the path to the enclosed garden, the roses there now dormant, their moment past for this year, their roots in the ground taking what the rain offers and storing it against the winter. She is glad for the rain. Rain in October is a form of provision, the ground receiving what it needs to sustain what is in it through the months of cold, banking the moisture for the roots of things that are not currently visible as growing, that appear dormant, that are in fact as active as they will be in June, but in an entirely underground and invisible way. This too is a form of work she recognizes, the underground kind, the kind that doesn't show. The rain continues, steady and unhurried, the way rain is in autumn, without the violence of summer storms, without the intermittent quality of spring rain, but with the sustained, patient delivery of something that the season is providing, simply because the season provides it. She makes tea. She carries it to the chair by the window and sits in it with the cup warming her hands and the rain on the glass and the garden, receiving the rain and the enclosed garden at the far end of the path, where the old roses are dormant and the roots are drinking. She is content in a way that has no particular source, the contentment of a person who is in the right place at the right time on an ordinary autumn afternoon, with rain on the garden and tea warming her hands and the house around her and everything, for this moment, as it should be. The moment holds. Then it passes, as moments do, into the next moment, which is also ordinary and also fine. There is a village at the edge of the estate whose name has not changed since the Domesday book. She has looked at the Domesday entry, in a transcription she found in the County Record Office years ago when she was researching the history of the property. The entry is brief, a few lines in the abbreviated Latin of Norman administration, recording the village's name, its holder, its assessment in hides and ploughlands, its value. Nothing that would read as significant to anyone not interested in the specific history of this specific place. She found it significant. She finds the continuity of the name across 1,000 years of change that included the Black Death, which reduced the village to a fraction of its earlier population, and the enclosures of the 18th century, which reshaped the landscape around it, and the agricultural depression of the 19th century, which altered the nature of the work that sustained it, and 2 world wars, and everything that came after. She finds the continuity of the name through all of that remarkable in a way that is difficult to express precisely, but that feels important. The name persists, the village persists. The people in it are entirely different from the people who were in it in 1086, connected to those people by no genealogical thread that could be traced, and yet the village continues, named the same, in the same place, performing versions of the same functions in the landscape of its county that it has performed for 1,000 years. This is a form of continuity that is not about the individual but about the pattern. The pattern persists while the individuals come and go, each one contributing something to the pattern by their presence and by the decisions they make within it, each one eventually departing and being replaced by someone who will contribute differently, but will still be part of the pattern. She has been part of this pattern for 60 years. The village at the edge of the estate has been part of it for 1,000. She's not inclined to find her 60 years trivial by comparison to the 1,000. The 60 years are what she has. The pattern requires every contribution that sustains it, including the smaller ones. The estate itself has a documented history of approximately 4 centuries, the first reliable records appearing in the 1580s, when the current land arrangements were beginning to take the shape that has been adjusted and modified since without being fundamentally altered. 4 centuries of a specific relationship between a specific piece of land and the people who have owned and worked and maintained and inherited it. She is a moment in that 4 centuries, a significant moment. She believes this based on the evidence. But a moment, and the significance of a moment, is not in its finitude but in what it accomplishes within its limits. What she has accomplished is the continuation of the pattern. The estate is still here, the village is still there, the trust arrangement ensures that the relationship between the family and the land will extend into the next generation, and the one after that. The house is maintained at a level that will allow the next generation to inherit it in sound condition. The books are on the shelves, the roses are in the enclosed garden. The pattern continues. She does not need it to be attributed to her. The pattern is larger than any attribution. It was here before her and will be here after her, in whatever form the future requires of it, and her contribution will be absorbed into the general texture of its continuity the way every contribution is absorbed, not erased but incorporated, present in the ongoing nature of the thing, without being extractable from it as a separate element. She will be in the estate the way her mother-in-law is in the roses, not visible as an individual influence, but present in the specific form of what grew under her particular kind of care. That is sufficient. That is what she worked for. The long continuity of small right decisions, each one adding its contribution to the pattern, none of them grand enough to require memorializing, all of them together producing the thing that persists. The village at the edge of the estate has its Domesday name. The house has its October light. The roses have their roots in the ground, drinking the October rain. She has her ledger and her pen and the teacup at the right temperature, and the early morning that comes every day, reliable as the pattern itself, the light arriving through the same windows into the same room where she's been arriving to work for 60 years. The work continues. He has been with the house for 31 years. She noticed, this autumn, the way the light falls differently on the fields when he walks them, not because the fields have changed, but because he walks them differently than he did in 1993, more slowly, with more pauses, with a particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who is looking at something he knows he is finishing with, rather than continuing with. He has not said this to her directly. He does not need to. She reads what is happening the way she reads everything, through the quality of presence, through the slight shifts in what is attended to and what is held. He will retire next spring. This is known between them without having been formally discussed, in the way that many of the important transitions in a long working relationship are known before they are spoken. She is prepared. The preparation in this case has involved 3 years of observing candidates, 2 years of narrowing, 1 year of the specific and systematic assessment of the person she has identified as the right replacement, and 6 months of the kind of indirect arrangement that positions a new working relationship correctly before the formal beginning of it. The new estate manager will begin in March. He is 38, which is young for the position, but the right kind of young, the kind that comes with a decade of relevant experience and a quality of attention that she has assessed across several years of observation, a quality that includes the patience for the long view, which is the single quality she will not compromise on. The handover will take a full year. She has designed the handover with the same deliberateness she brings to everything. The current manager and the new one will overlap for 12 months, working in parallel on every aspect of the estate, so that the knowledge that the current manager carries, the specific local knowledge, the relationships with the tenants and the contractors and the suppliers, the understanding of the estate's particular vulnerabilities and the particular weather patterns that affect it, and the particular decisions that have been deferred and the reasons they have been deferred, all of that transfers as completely as a 12-month overlap can transfer it. Some of it will not transfer fully. It never does. The new manager will learn some things by experience that cannot be transmitted by explanation. He will make some mistakes that the current manager would not have made. This is acceptable. The mistakes will be small ones, because the structures she has put in place will catch the significant errors, and the current manager's presence during the transition year will catch most of the others. What will transfer is the relationship with her, which is the most important thing. He will have a year to understand how she thinks and what she values, and what questions she will ask and what answers she will accept. He will have a year to show her how he thinks, which she's already partially informed about from the assessment period, but not yet fully informed, and the full information will emerge only in the work itself. She looks forward to this, in the measured way she looks forward to things, not with excitement exactly, but with the genuine interest of someone for whom a new working relationship is a genuinely interesting thing, a new intelligence to understand and engage with and eventually to trust. Trust takes time. She knows this and accepts it and is prepared to give it the time it requires. The current manager is walking the Eastfield this afternoon, in the October light, with the particular deliberateness of someone who is walking a known field and attending to it with a fullness that suggests the walking is also a form of farewell, or at least of setting, the accumulation of the last observations, the final filing of the sensory record. She watches him from the window of the morning room. 31 years. The estate has benefited from his presence in ways that the accounts record and in ways that they do not, and both are real and both are part of what he is leaving behind. She will tell him this, at the appropriate moment, in the appropriate form. He deserves to hear it. The field is golden in the autumn light, the way fields are golden in October, the colour of the year's completion, the last warmth before the cold and the bare months, and then the slow return of green in spring. He walks it steadily, the estate manager of 31 years, and she watches him walk it, and the house is quiet around her, and the morning is nearly over. There are afternoons that last longer than their hours. Not in any mystical sense. The clock in the hall marks them the same as every other afternoon, and the light moves through the sky at the same rate it has always moved. But in the subjective experience of someone who has been awake since 5:30, and who has done the morning's work and who sits now in the afternoon light of the morning room with no immediate requirement of attention, the afternoon can open into a kind of spaciousness that is not available at other times of day. She allows herself these afternoons deliberately, not frequently. She's not a person who easily tolerates the unscheduled, but with enough regularity that they have become part of the rhythm of her weeks, the deliberate openings in the structure that allow the thing within the structure to breathe. In these afternoons she does not plan, she does not assess or decide or make entries in the ledger. She sits in the afternoon light and allows the day's accumulated information to settle into whatever pattern it will naturally settle into, the way sediment settles in still water without assistance, into an arrangement that is both specific and inevitable. What she finds in these settling afternoons is usually clarity, not of any specific question. She does not sit down with a problem and expect to rise with an answer, but a clarified sense of the whole, a reperception of the current state of the thing she is managing that has the quality of perspective recovered. The way the garden looks sometimes, when you look at it after a period of close attention to a specific part, the full design reasserting itself after the tunnel vision of detailed work. The full design is good. She has been aware of this for some time, aware that the work of the last decades has produced something that will hold, that the structures are sound, that the people are adequate to their responsibilities, that the relationship with the granddaughter who comes on Tuesdays is proceeding in exactly the direction it needs to proceed. This awareness is not complacency. She is not, in these settling afternoons, telling herself that the work is done and the rest is certainty. The rest is not certainty. There will be difficulties she cannot anticipate, decisions the future will require that she has not been able to make in advance, challenges to the structures that will test their strength in ways she will not be present to observe. She holds this clearly. She simply also holds with equal clarity that she has done what can be done with the time and the resources and the intelligence available to her, and that what can be done has been done well, and that the doing has produced something that is more likely than not to persist into the future she cares about. More likely than not, this is the standard she has always held herself to. Not certainty, which is not available, but the honest best assessment of probability, made after the most thorough analysis available to her, resulting in the action most likely to produce the desired outcome, accepted with the equanimity of someone who has made their best decision and released the outcome to the future. The afternoon light in the morning room in October is the colour of the light in the painting in the East drawing room. Warm, slightly amber, the quality that October afternoons have in this latitude, in this specific configuration of rooms, the light coming through the west-facing windows at an angle that will become more acute over the next month, and then begin its slow return to the north as the year turns past its nadir. She has watched this light for 60 years. She is watching it now. The house is quiet. The estate manager has come in from the east field. The garden is receiving the last of the afternoon. The yew hedge stands at its full height against the sky. She folds her hands in her lap. She is, for this particular afternoon in its particular light, simply here. Not planning, not deciding, not protecting or assessing or managing. Simply present in the house she has kept, in the afternoon that is lasting, in the quiet that is the accumulated quiet of everything that has been in some sense settled. The first thing she does every morning is open the curtains. Not with haste. The day does not require haste at 5:30 when the rest of the household is still asleep and the first light is still grey and tentative at the horizon. She opens them with the steady, deliberate quality that she brings to all routine actions, the quality that comes from 60 years of the same action in the same room, from the muscle memory of it, and from the knowledge that the action matters, that beginning the day with the opening of the curtains is a physical statement about the relationship between the person in the room and the world outside it. She looks out at the garden. Even on the mornings when the sky's entirely overcast and the garden is a range of greens and greys without specific light, she looks at it for the moment, between the opening of the curtains and the moving toward the desk. She takes in whatever the morning is offering, the weather, the state of the garden, the quality of the air if she has cracked the window slightly, the particular quality of 5:30 in this season. This moment is not in the ledger. It is not in any document. It is simply the beginning of the day, the transition from the private night self to the working morning self, done the same way every day for 60 years. And the last thing before she sleeps is the turning down of the bedside lamp. Not complicated, not ceremonial, simply the act that concludes the day, the movement of the hand to the switch, the room going dark, the bed's warmth and weight, and the specific quality of this room in the dark, which she knows as thoroughly as she knows anything, which is the most completely familiar interior she will ever inhabit. Between the opening of the curtains and the turning down of the lamp, she manages the fortune and tends the garden and receives the granddaughter, and reads the trust documents and has the conversations and makes the small, precise entries in the ledger. Between those two simple actions, she does everything she does. She has opened those curtains and turned down that lamp more than 20,000 times. The fortune has survived all 20,000 of those days. The house has survived them. The garden grows. The trust holds. The granddaughter comes on Tuesdays. The first thing and the last thing repeated are what constitute a life of sustained purpose, not the grand gestures, not the exceptional decisions, though there have been some of both, but the repetition, the daily return to the work, the accumulated mornings of the 5:30 rising, and the open curtain and the grey or golden or overcast light on the garden. She is ready for the dark. The lamp goes down. The room is its nighttime self, warm and entirely familiar. The sounds of the house in their evening register, the slight settling of old wood, the distant weather on the roof, the particular silence that this room holds that is different from the silence of any other room in the house. She closes her eyes. The house is all around her. The fortune is as it should be. The yew hedge is in the dark outside the window, growing imperceptibly, the way yew grows, not visibly, not dramatically, but continuously, adding its small increment to the form that will be 14 feet and then 15, and then beyond the height she will see. The roses are in the ground. The ledger is on the desk. The curtains will open again at 5:30. For now there is only the dark and the warmth and the house breathing around her, and the long, complete record of a life spent in the patient and deliberate keeping of something worth keeping. She is very still. The room is still. There is a thought she's had in the later years, with a frequency and a clarity that she neither promotes nor resists, what the house will be without her. Not melancholy. The thought arrives without melancholy, which is itself a function of the completeness she feels about the work she has done, the sense that the thing is as ready as she can make it, the structures sound and the people prepared, and the objects in their places and the books on their shelves and the roses in the ground. The house without her will be the house with someone else in it, tending what she has tended, continuing what she has continued. It will be the same house in the ways that matter, and a different house in the ways that are natural, the ways in which any house becomes different when the person who has inhabited it longest is gone, and the person who has inherited it brings their own presence to bear on its rooms and its rhythms. The granddaughter will do this. She will open the curtains in the morning, but perhaps not at 5:30. She will sit at the rosewood desk, but she will reorganize the drawer in the way that makes sense to her particular habits, and the reorganization will be right for her the way the current arrangement is right for the grandmother. She will have Tuesday afternoons with her own granddaughter, decades from now, and those conversations will carry forward something of what the current Tuesday conversations carry, in the form that the granddaughter has absorbed and will transmit in her own particular way. The continuity is not identical repetition. It is the transmission of a quality, the quality of attention, the habit of the long view, the willingness to do the difficult work without requiring recognition for it. That quality will be present in the granddaughter, because it is already present in her, visible in the questions she asks and the notes she takes in the archive of her attention. The house will know her eventually the way it knows the grandmother now. It will take time, 60 years, or 30, or some different number, depending on how long and how completely she inhabits it. The house accumulates the people who are in it gradually, holding their presence in the particular way that old houses hold things, not in any mystical sense, but in the concrete sense of the marks of use and habitation, the worn spot on the stair, the window latch that requires a specific angle to close, the smell of the morning room in November that is partly the room and partly the long occupation of the room by a specific person's specific habits. The grandmother will be in those marks after she's gone. She'll be in the worn stair and the window latch and the November smell of beeswax and cold that is hers as much as the room's. She'll be in the trust documents and the estate archives and the row of letters in the folder in the desk drawer, and the form of the yew hedge and the placement of the rose beds and the organisation of the bookshelves. She will be in the fact that the thing continues. And that, she thinks, on this evening, in this house, with the October dark outside the window and the fire at the low end of its evening burn, and the lamp making its pool of warm light on the page of the book she has just closed and will not open again tonight. That is enough. More than enough. It is, in fact, everything she was working toward, arrived at, accomplished, present now in the house around her in the form of a quiet and complete rightness. She sits with it for a moment. Then she turns down the lamp. The house at the deepest point of the night is perfectly still. Not the performed stillness of the afternoon that lasted, not the deliberate stillness of the early morning at the desk. The deepest stillness, the stillness that exists between midnight and the first suggestion of dawn, is the stillness that needs nothing from anyone. That is simply the house at rest, not waiting, not anticipating, just existing in its full and quiet wait at the point when the day has completely ended and the new day has not yet begun to assert itself. She's awake in it some nights, gently awake, without urgency, without the 3 a.m. anxiety of her 70s. She lies in the familiar dark and lets the house's nighttime presence surround her. The specific quality of the dark in this room, the weight of the covers, the sound of the house in its thermal rest. There is a kind of peace available at this hour that is not available at any other. It is the peace of having done the work, not finished it, and the work does not finish, or rather it finishes only when the person doing it finishes, and even then it continues in different hands, and the quality of the continuation is the measure of how well the work was done. But the peace of having done the work for today, and for the days before today, and the work of the structure building that is largely complete, the structures in place, the people positioned, the garden planted, the bookshelves holding their books in their specific order. The peace of a person at the end of a long day of good work. She holds this for a while. Then she sleeps. And in the morning, when the grey pre-dawn light is just becoming perceptible at the edge of the curtains, she rises at 5:30 and opens them and looks at the garden, and moves to the desk and opens the ledger and picks up the pen and begins. The continuity is the thing. The continuity is everything. The light before dawn in October is nothing like the light of day. It has its own quality, a very deep blue in the first moments, so close to darkness that it is identifiable as a light only because the eye, after the hours of complete dark, recognizes the faintest shift toward brightness. The horizon where the sky meets the top of the yew hedge is this colour, visible from the bedroom window when she stands at the glass just before opening the curtains. She stands there for a moment before she opens them. One moment, every morning, in which the world is this deep blue, in which the garden is still entirely in night, and the sky is beginning, in the most tentative and gradual way, to become day, in which everything is possible in the way that things are possible at the beginning, before the light makes them specific, before the day's requirements announce themselves, and the choosing of one direction necessarily closes the others. She stands in the deep blue of the pre-dawn and holds the moment. Then she opens the curtains. The light is grey now. The blue has shifted in the minute she stood at the glass, moved toward the softer ambiguity of pre-dawn grey, the sky lightening from the east, where the sun is still below the horizon, but its approach is making itself felt in the quality of the air and the first distinguishing of shapes in the garden below the window. The yew hedge is visible now, dark green, slightly darker than the sky against which it stands, its form exact and familiar and correct. The rose beds are there, the stone path, the enclosed garden at the end of it, its gate just visible as a darker shape in the dark green of the surrounding hedge. The house is waking around her. The radiators have come on. She can hear the distant knock of the old pipes finding their temperature, the familiar percussion of the house's morning warm-up that has been part of the sound of her mornings here for as long as the house has had central heating. The kitchen will be warm by 7. The housekeeper will arrive at 8. The solicitor has an appointment at 11. She moves toward the desk. The ledger is there. The pen is there. The teacup will be outside the door in 12 minutes, delivered by the person who's been delivering it without knocking for 14 years, and who will continue to deliver it, she trusts, until someone or something changes. She opens the ledger to the current page. The entry she makes this morning is a small one, a quarterly note, a review of a recurring item. The hand that makes it is steady and small and has not changed substantially in 50 years. The morning light continues its gradual arrival, the grey becoming slowly more decided, the shapes in the garden becoming more specific, the yew hedge resolving from a dark form against a lighter sky into its full particular form, green and dense and 14 feet tall, and exactly what she planted in May of 1961. She makes the entry. She sets down the pen. She sits for a moment in the morning light with the ledger open and the garden visible through the window and the house awake around her. Then she picks the pen up again. There is more to do. There is always more to do. And she does it quietly in the early morning before the rest of the world has begun. The painting has watched the room for 47 years. It watched the decade in which she was in her 60s, and the management was in its most active phase, when the decisions she was making were the largest she would make, the restructuring of the trust and the adaptation of the portfolio, and the long conversations with the solicitor about what should happen and when. The painting watched those conversations from above the fireplace with its inward expression, the woman in the chair with the folded hands and the quality of attending to something the viewer cannot see. It watched the decade of the deaths, her second son, her youngest daughter, the friends who were the first of her age cohort to go, and then more of them, and then more, the slow thinning of the generation that had shared the particular experience of a particular time. The painting watched her receive this with the steadiness that was always hers, the private grief and the public continuity, the desk in the morning and the garden in the afternoon. It watched the decade of the grandchildren becoming adults, the Tuesday conversations beginning, and then establishing their rhythm, and then deepening into what they are now, the passing of the quality of attention from the generation that holds it to the generation that will need it. The painting watched this with its fixed expression and its knowledge that it would be here for whatever came next. It will be here for whatever comes next. She looks at it now, this evening, from the chair across the room. Not from her own chair, but from the other one, the chair she uses when she has a guest, placed at a different angle that gives a different view of the room. She's sitting in it tonight for no particular reason, or for the reason that small variations in the routine are themselves a kind of attentiveness, a way of preventing the familiar from becoming invisible. From this angle, the painting is slightly different. The expression is the same. It is always the same. It is oil on canvas, and it will always be the same until the painting is gone. But the relationship between the expression and the room is different from this angle. The painted woman is looking from here, slightly past the fireplace and toward the window, toward the October evening sky that is not yet fully dark, where the last of the day's colour is fading in the west. She's looking toward what is fading. The old woman in the other chair is also looking toward the window. They are both, in their different forms of stillness, watching the evening. The last light in the west is the particular orange that October evenings produce just before they go to deep blue. Not a warm orange, but a clear one, the colour of something very pure and very brief, present for a few minutes at the horizon before the deep blue comes in from the east and the orange retreats and then disappears. She watches it. Then it is gone, and the room is in its evening register, the lamp's warm light and the fire's lower contribution, the room as she has known it for 60 years in the evening, everything in its place. The portrait above the fireplace and the bookshelves along the north wall and the small rosewood desk in the corner, and the chair she's sitting in and the chair she's not sitting in. Everything still. Everything here. The fortune is as it should be. The house is as it should be. The garden is in its October state. the roses dormant and the yew hedge standing, and the stone path wet from the afternoon's rain, and the enclosed garden at the end of it, with the old roses' bare canes visible over the low stone wall. All of it there in the dark, continuing its particular life in the dark, the way things continue when no one is watching, not stopping, not waiting, simply being what they are in the conditions that exist. She is quiet. The house is quiet. The evening deepens. She will make one more entry before the year ends. She does not know yet what it will say. The entry will be what the entry needs to be, the December review, the annual reconciliation of the year's decisions against the year's outcomes, the small and careful notation that closes the ledger's current year and prepares the space for the next one. It will be precise, and it will be in the hand that has not changed substantially in 50 years, and it will mean exactly what it says. She does not yet know the whole shape of this year. There are things still to happen in the weeks remaining, the conversation with the solicitor that will complete the trust amendment, the handover conversation with the estate manager that has been building toward itself all autumn, the Christmas gathering with its long tables and its candlelight, and everyone she loves in the same room. She looks forward to these remaining weeks with genuine interest. Not the interest of someone who needs the weeks to be exceptional. They will be ordinary weeks, as most weeks are ordinary, and the ordinariness is itself fine. It is in fact what she has been building toward, the ordinary continuity of the thing, its unremarkable daily operation. But the ordinary weeks have their particular satisfactions, and she knows what they are, and she looks forward to them specifically. The solicitor conversation and its completion, the estate manager conversation, and the quality of acknowledgement it will carry, the December dinner and its specific warmth. These are the satisfactions of a life that is still, at its great age, engaged with the actual work of the world. Not observing from a distance, not attending things ceremonially, but doing the work, making the entries, having the conversations, receiving the Tuesday afternoon visitors with their hopeful questions and their good minds and their genuine capacity to carry what they are being trusted with. The year is almost done. It was a good year. She makes this assessment with the same method she brings to everything, against the evidence, with awareness of the ways in which the assessment might be optimistic, with an honest accounting of what didn't go as it should have, and a clear final judgment that the year was, on balance, what a year should be. A good year. The structures held, the people did what they needed to do, the garden survived its seasons, the house had its October light. The ledger is on the desk, open to the current page. She does not open it tonight. Tonight it holds what it holds. The year's record nearly complete, waiting for the December entry that will close it. She puts the cap on her pen. She sets it beside the ledger, where it always is. The morning room is warm. The fire is at its evening stage, the stage before she lets it go to embers, a comfortable domestic warmth that fills the lower portion of the room and makes the lamplight above it brighter by contrast. She is content. She's very content, in a way that requires no particular condition to sustain it, not the absence of difficulty, not the presence of company, not any specific external arrangement, but the interior condition of someone who is doing the work they were meant to do in the place they are meant to be for the people they love in the hours of their life that remain. This is what she was making, she understands, all along, not just the trust and the house and the fortune and the garden. This exact quality of evening in this exact room, with the ledger on the desk and the work nearly done for the day and the good year drawing toward its close. The fire settles. The lamp holds. She closes her eyes. She opens the curtains. The pre-dawn light is the particular deep blue of October, the sky beginning its long way toward the day at the eastern edge, the garden below the window still in the last of the night. The yew hedge is there, the rose beds, the stone path to the enclosed garden. All of it there, as it has always been there, as it will be there tomorrow and in the tomorrows that follow hers, tended by the hands she has prepared, sustained by the structures she has made, carrying forward in the unhurried way that gardens carry things forward, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but continuously, adding each small increment to the form that is always still becoming what it will be. She stands for a moment in the pre-dawn blue. Then she crosses to the desk, The ledger is there, the pen is there, the teacup is outside the door. She sits down. She opens the ledger to the current page. She picks up the pen. This is what she's always done, in every season of the long work, the opening of the curtains and the garden scene, and the desk and the pen, and the small precise entry that adds its measure to the record of the thing she's kept. The light at the edge of the curtains is beginning its change from blue toward grey. The house will wake. The day will arrive with its requirements. The solicitor at 11, the granddaughter next Tuesday, the December gathering, with its long tables and its candlelight, and everyone she loves along the length of it, in whatever form they come. All of that ahead. All of that present already in the day that is beginning. But right now, in this particular morning, before any of it has arrived, in the pre-dawn quiet, in the house at its most still, in the room where the work has been done for 60 years and will be done for a little while longer, there is only this. The ledger, the pen, the garden in the last of the blue dark outside the window. The yew hedge standing. The roses in the ground. The work continuing. She makes the entry. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Which grandmother in your own family quietly kept everything together? And did she ever get the credit she deserved? Let us know in the comments. A tenancy managed well is a relationship of decades. She has tenants on the estate whose families have been on the same farms for 4 generations, families whose grandparents were here when she arrived, whose parents she watched grow up and take over the farms from their own parents, whose children are now the adults conducting the annual review meetings in the estate office, with the calm familiarity of people who have been sitting in that room their entire lives. The relationship between a landlord and a long-term tenant is one of the most complex human relationships in the management of inherited property. It is not a simple commercial transaction. The lease with its terms and its rent review dates, and its repair obligations. It is also a relationship of dependency and trust and mutual history, a relationship in which both parties hold something the other needs, and in which the quality of the management determines, over decades, whether the relationship produces goodwill or resentment or something between the two. She has managed it toward goodwill. Not by being soft, which would serve neither party. The rents are at market rates, reviewed on schedule, neither artificially depressed out of sentiment nor pushed above the market to extract the maximum possible return. The repair obligations are enforced on both sides. The tenant keeps the holding in the condition required by the lease, and the estate undertakes the repairs that are the estate's responsibility, on time and to the required standard, without requiring the tenant to chase. This sounds like simple adherence to the terms of a contract. It is in practice much more than that. Most landlords in this category allow the repair obligations to drift, allowing the tenant to defer their obligations out of a desire to avoid conflict, or failing to meet the estate's own obligations out of the cost-saving instinct that becomes, over time, a form of disinvestment in the relationship's future. She is not allowed drift in either direction. The result is tenants who have stayed, across 4 generations, on farms that are in good condition and that produce good returns, returns that are fair to the tenant and adequate to the estate, in the relationship of mutual benefit that good tenancy management produces. She walks the farms each year, in October when the harvest is in, and the year's agricultural story is readable in the state of the fields and the buildings. She does this with the estate manager, who provides the professional assessment, and she does it also in the private mode of her own observation, looking at the farms with eyes that have been looking at them for 60 years, that know what they looked like in good years and difficult ones, that can see in the condition of the October fields both the current state and the comparison with every previous state held in memory. The farms are good. Some are better than they have been. One, on the northern edge of the estate, is showing signs of the kind of gradual mismanagement that is difficult to identify until it has been going on for long enough to be visible, and she has noted it, and it will be addressed in the January meeting in the specific and careful way that addresses things without damaging the relationship that allows the addressing. This is the granular texture of the work, not the trust documents or the portfolio strategy, or the long conversations with the granddaughter about the future. Those are the visible architecture. but the October walk through the farms, the eye that sees the condition of the fields and the buildings and measures them against the memory of what they were, and the knowledge of what they should be, the note made in the margin of the estate manager's report, the January meeting held in the right tone with the right information. This is the daily substance. This is what 60 years of management looks like in a specific October field. Patience is not the same as passivity, and the confusion between the two has cost more fortunes than any amount of bad investment or catastrophic expenditure. Passive patience waits for things to resolve themselves, accepts whatever outcome time produces, and attributes the resulting good or bad fortune to external forces rather than to the quality of the waiting. Active patience does something entirely different. It maintains the situation in the condition most favourable to the desired outcome, while the time required for that outcome to become available passes, tending the conditions, preventing deterioration, watching for the moment when action is appropriate and being ready when it arrives. She has practiced active patience for 60 years. The distinction becomes visible in its effects over time. The passively patient person and the actively patient person may look identical in the short term, both of them declining to act, both of them describing their position as one of considered waiting. But the conditions in which the actively patient person waits are maintained and managed, while the conditions in which the passively patient person waits are allowed to drift. And drift, sustained over time, produces results that require active correction to reverse, correction that may not always be available at the point when it becomes necessary. She has never allowed drift, not for long. The annual reviews, the quarterly reports, the monthly conversations with the estate manager, the weekly attention to the ledger, all of these are instruments of active patience, the mechanisms by which the situation is maintained while time does its work. Time does considerable work when the conditions are right. A trust arrangement that seems restrictive in year 5 is experienced as appropriate by year 20, when the heir whose early requests it declined has arrived at the stage of a life in which the protection it offered is visibly worthwhile. A tenant relationship that requires investment in the early years of poor performance, investment in conversation, in the patient assessment of what is genuinely temporary difficulty versus what is structural mismanagement, produces, in the families where the difficulty was temporary, the most loyal and productive long-term tenancy. She has waited 20 years for some of these things. The waiting was worth it. The worth of it is visible now, in the state of the estate and the state of the trust and the state of the relationship with the granddaughter who comes on Tuesdays, all of them in the condition that active patience over decades produces. Not perfect. Active patience does not guarantee perfection. It guarantees the best achievable outcome given the material and the circumstances, which is all that any honest management can claim to guarantee. The best achievable outcome is what she has. The mornings that repeated across 60 years were not identical. Each one was the same in its structure, the 5:30 rising, the curtains, the garden, the desk, the ledger, the pen, and different in its content, in what the ledger needed, in what the garden showed through the window, in what was present in the early morning thinking that ran below the surface of the routine actions. Some mornings were easy, the kind of morning in which the work is clear and the energy is present, and the thinking comes without resistance, and the entries in the ledger are made with a fluency that reflects a mind and a situation in good alignment. These mornings were not unusual. She has had many of them across 60 years, enough to form the comfortable backbone of the routine, the majority experience of the practice. Some mornings were difficult. The mornings in the months after each of the deaths, her son, her daughter, her husband in the longest ago year, when the rising at 5:30 required something additional, some act of will beyond the simply habitual, something that said, the grief is real and present, and you are going to open the curtains and sit down at the desk and make the entry, because that is what you do, and the grief and the doing can coexist, and both are required, and the one does not cancel the other. She made the entry on those mornings too. Not immediately, not the next day or the day after. She gave herself the time that the loss required, the time that genuine grief requires before the doing can resume without the resumption being a betrayal. But when she returned to the desk, she returned fully, in the complete way that returning requires, not tentatively or reluctantly, but with the quality of decision that makes a return rather than a partial approach. The practice absorbed the difficulty and continued. This is what practices do when they are deep enough and old enough. They hold the difficult times not by resolving them but by being present through them, by offering the familiar structure of the desk and the pen and the ledger as a form of continuity through periods when everything else feels interrupted. She has depended on this through the worst of the 60 years. The worst years are part of the record too. The ledger holds the entries of every year, including the difficult ones, and the entries of the difficult years are the same as the entries of the easy ones. Small, precise, in the hand that has not changed substantially in 50 years. They do not announce their difficulty, they simply are what they are, making their small contribution to the record of the thing she has kept. The record continues. The morning comes. The curtains open. The garden is there. The light outside the window is the pre-dawn blue of October, turning now at the horizon toward grey, the day beginning its long and patient arrival. The ledger is on the desk. The pen is beside it. The house is still and warm and completely itself, holding its 60 years of morning and evening and October light and December candlelight and the work that was done in every one of those years, the small decisions and the large ones, and the ones that looked small at the time and turned out to be the ones that mattered most. All of it here, in the air of the rooms, in the form of the garden, in the structure of the trust that is doing right now what it was designed to do. She picks up the pen. She begins.